I always remember this as happening exactly after my 8th wedding anniversary. I was working nights at the time, so me and my husband ended up having the whole night to ourselves. Needless to say, I was in something of a chipper mood by the time I got to work. It was around 3:30 in the morning, and I was sitting in my pod telling my coworkers how my husband had gotten me a spa day. The last thing I hear before the phone rings is one of them say, "Bring back some face masks so we can pamper ourselves in the dispatch center." The thought of us doing our jobs with mud masks on made me laugh out loud, and I had to calm myself a little before picking up the call. That's the thing about working dispatch. Your shift goes from 1 to 100 with some calls. You're just sitting there, minding your own business, and the emergency just comes to you. And Jesus Christ, was this one an emergency? I opened with the usual, 911, what is your emergency? And I hear a soft, whispered female voice, couldn't have been any older than a teenager, say, "I can't do this anymore. Please help me." Right when I ask where she's at, I hear a male voice shouting, and then a banging sound as if someone is trying to break into the room this girl is in. I dispatch a nearby unit of cops as quickly as I can, telling them it's a potential domestic violence situation. In a way, it was a potential domestic, but in others, it was much, much worse. This girl was 13 years old, not much older than my son is now, and she had a gun to her head. It was her father on the other side of the door, and he was indeed trying his darndest to break it down. But it wasn't to hurt her. It was to stop his daughter from shooting herself. I joined him, pleading with the girl in as calm and calculated a way as possible to put the gun down, but all she did was say it again. "I can't do this anymore," before she pulled the trigger. I'll never forget the bang, or the screaming on the line as her father finally broke the door in, and the sound of him screaming how sorry he was. That shrill, empty, hollow shrieking. It'll forever be burned into my memory. It was probably one of the single worst moments of my entire life, but still, I had to keep it together and keep working. "Pick up the phone, sir. Please pick it up," I kept saying. "I need to walk you through CPR, sir. Please pick up the phone. Deputies are coming. Paramedics are coming. But please pick up the phone." No one picked up the phone. I don't think he could hear me over his own screams. I stayed on the open line, calling out to someone to pick up, but there was a weird noise before the screaming sounded further away, almost like the phone had been tossed to one side. As the paramedics and deputies finally arrived on the scene, they called it. There wasn't a surgeon in the world that could have saved that girl's life. The contents of her skull were spread all over her bedroom wall. Signal 7. That was her name now. Death investigation. As I disconnected the call, I remember my upcoming spa just popping into my head. Like a weird, now where was I moment. I guess that's just how we compartmentalize things. It occurred to me that that little girl would never have a spa trip anniversary present from her husband, and how tragic that was. A dumb, self-centered thought, I know, but it was just how my mind opted to process the horror of what I'd just been exposed to. I didn't cry until I drove home. A full hour's drive of just non-stop, ugly sobbing. Pulling into my driveway, I wiped my face, went into my kids' room and hugged them. They started crying too, confused and frightened as to why I was so upset. I guess that wasn't quite the right call, but I just couldn't help it. It was just something I needed to do. A good number of years have passed since I got that call, and it definitely wasn't the last time that I had to deal with something like that. Trouble is, they never get any easier. You just learn to deal with the fallout better, to just keep on going and keep answering those calls. Dispatch is a crazy job to say the very least. One call you're talking to a toddler who's just had a nightmare, but doesn't want to wake up his mom or dad. The next minute you're listening to someone taking their last breath. I even got a call from someone reporting Taco Bell for getting their order wrong. Dispatchers get threats, they get screamed at, they get called every curse word ever conceived. But we keep going. We keep answering those calls. We lose coworkers that take their own lives every single year. The stress of the job is extremely high, and there's very little in the way of closure for those that need it. Dispatchers carry a heavy burden, long after the call has ended. This happened during my final year of EMS dispatch, and honestly, it's one of the calls that started me off thinking about quitting. I get a call from a frantic woman who said that she'd walked into her apartment to find her roommate hanging from a hook over a door frame. She'd been holding the girl's legs up to loosen the noose while she called 911, but she didn't have the strength to hold her up much longer and had no idea what to do other than call 911. I ask where exactly in the apartment she is, and she says the door frame between the kitchen and the hallway. I ask if it would be possible to gently lower her friend, run into the kitchen and grab a knife to cut them down. She says she thinks so. I counter into it like, okay ma'am, we're gonna grab a knife in 3, 2, 1, go. I hear her grunt a little as she lowers the body, then cutlery jingling together as she grabs a knife, and finally, the thud of her roommate's body hitting the floor as she succeeded in cutting the rope. Okay, I cut her down, she says after grabbing the phone again. I tell her the EMTs are on their way, but then I finally get to asking her how long her friend had been hanging. She tells me she has no idea, that she's been working all day. I tell her to begin CPR if she knows it, which she does, and after a few cycles of chest compressions and mouth-to-mouth, she picks up the phone again and says, I don't think it's working. I tell her to keep going and that it's essential to keep trying. That's when the lady hits me with, but she's cold. She's so cold. I had to take a minute to compose myself. Those words hit me like a ton of bricks for some reason. I dealt with worse calls than that. Straight up triple murders, assaults, all that, but hearing this girl tell me how cold her friend was just tore me up. Just over a year later, I retired. I don't regret my career in dispatch, and I know I made a difference out there. But there's only so much one person can take, and it was that call among a handful of others that just pushed me over the edge. I'm a former chief of police in Glenlyn, Florida. A call began like this, like any other. 911, what's your emergency? A woman is screaming frantically, saying, an alligator ate part of my baby. My dispatchers tried their best to get some straight answers out of her, but even when she stopped screaming down the phone, all she'll say is, we were just walking along the sidewalk and out of nowhere, an alligator jumped out of the water and ate part of my baby. Living in Florida, this was entirely possible, and we'd had all prepared for the worst possible outcome. Police arrived on scene, then the fire department, and an ambulance not far away. The fire department medic was the first to arrive, but he radios in that the other units should abort. Of course, the first thought was the child was dead and no EMTs would be needed. And a few minutes later, the medic said animal control was needed. I'm thinking, Jesus Christ, this poor woman, what a terrible thing to happen. Then out of nowhere, I hear something over the radio like, is that a leash? There was a leash hanging out of the alligator's mouth. The baby the woman had been referring to wasn't a human baby at all. It was her freaking dog. It's something we laugh about now, but after all the horror and fear over this fictional poor kid's life, we were straight up angry when we found out. It didn't help that the woman complained that no one would take her to the hospital or take what was left of her dog. There wasn't much to the vet. All I can say is, thank God no humans were injured. Believe me, I do feel bad for the dog, sure, and the lady, but let your dog run off wild near the rivers or lakes in the Sunshine State? You didn't bring your dog for a walk. You brought it as an appetizer. As a dispatcher, I had a call come in from a woman who was screaming that someone in the house was being stabbed. We knew it was serious as screams could be heard in the background as well as a man yelling and cursing. Dispatch was quickly able to determine the location and had cars en route. The dispatcher attempted to keep the caller on the line, but the attacker wasn't done. He found her on the phone and began stabbing her as she's screaming into the telephone, "Help, he's killing me," before she dropped the phone. He could be heard in the background yelling at his victim as he went about his continued gruesome attack. The accused in the matter was served with a restraining order that very day. He returned to the home and was banned from entering and went on a killing spree. 2 other relatives in the house were also stabbed before he killed his ex-girlfriend and stabbed himself. His stab wounds were described as being superficial and non-life-threatening. The officers could be heard arriving at the scene just a minute or 2 after they were dispatched, but it was too late for this domestic violence victim. A recording of the call is used in both our training of new dispatchers and also new officers. The blood-curdling screams and pleading of this young woman on the phone leave an indelible impression on everyone who hears it. The only silver lining is that the murderer will die in prison. Around 25 years ago, it was a typical serene Sunday morning in the upstate New York Sheriff's Office 911 center I worked in. But when I say New York, I mean way upstate. Think the Adirondack Mountains, streams, beautiful lakes, and people from Long Island in their summer homes. The most serious calls we ever took tended to be accidents on the interstate highway that ran the length of the country, or domestic disputes that never involved an arrest. May I remind you that this was a long time ago, and house fires. You get the idea. Sunday shift, picture the serene, newspapers out on the consoles, Dunkin' Donuts still gave free donuts and coffee to road patrol deputies, and us underpaid, forgotten, and normally overworked dispatchers. 911 rang, and I was so bored that I actually jumped on it, thinking it's probably a parking complaint about a church from a frequent flyer with nothing else to do. Nope. Open line in the actual freaking middle of butt-kiss nowhere. A minimum of 20 minutes response time for any unit, police, fire, or EMS. Instantly you know it's going to be a tough call. I heard an adult female in the background say, "Oh my God," before adding something about burning. She then picked up the phone and adds a desperate "help" before it sounded an awful lot like she dropped the phone again. Next thing I heard was a door of some description slamming. Then about 30 seconds later, a distant bang, like a firework or maybe a propane canister exploding. Well, I dispatch all 3 types of emergency units as per policy with unconfirmed type of emergencies, but I was 100% sure the house was on fire because of the burning comment. And then I heard, "Please help me," again, only very softly. Positive that the house was burning, I tried in vain to get a response and kept asking if she was alone, get out, etc., all the while updating and expediting units on the radio. First volunteer fire chief arrived and reported no fire, so instantly I'm like, what's going on here? But the fire chief ran around the house checking for smoke, but instead he found the man in the backyard, motionless and holding a gun. This is the day I found out that a 12-gauge shotgun fired point-blank into the chest of a 30-year-old woman holding a phone sounds almost identical to the sound a screen door makes when it slams. I listened to the poor woman's last words as she died alone on her kitchen floor, and I also somehow managed to send a firefighter directly into a life-threatening situation. There's no academy course that exists that can teach you how to deal with stuff like that. Took me a long time to stop equating a slamming screen door with gunfire. Try explaining that to your family and friends when one of them lets the screen door close a little too hard on Labor Day weekend. Anyway, the firefighter turned tail and ran, and the guy turned the gun on himself instead, but didn't get it quite right and survived initially. The number of resources spent trying to save him before his inevitable death was ridiculous. But because I was also a volunteer EMT, I understood it. The medics on scene even got med flights to transfer him to a trauma center, but they couldn't save him. So I guess karma worked well that day. As a dispatcher, I get some pretty wild calls. And I remember I got a call from a woman who said her husband and son had gotten into a fight that had gotten totally out of hand. Sadly to say, that kind of thing is way more common than you'd think, to the point where I'd even call it a run-of-the-mill domestic situation. In those types of situations, we're trained to send a minimum of 2 units, one to break up the fight, and another to gather up all the necessary statements. While they're on their way, I ask the woman what her husband and son are fighting over, whether this is regular behavior for them, and the whole time I can still hear them screaming and shouting in the background. Occasionally a door will slam, the voices get louder, the woman begs them to stop, and the cycle just keeps going on. She told me that they would argue regularly, but she'd never felt the need to call 911 before. This time was different, she said, and I could hear the terror in her voice that confirmed this is true for me. She started to tell me how their son had been staying with them since his divorce the previous year. I ask her how old her son is, and she says 43. Now I'm instantly taken aback here. I had it in my head that the son was in his teenage years, as this is most commonly when the father-son clashes occur. She actually manages to calm down a little as she tells the story, and I begin to really feel for this family. The son had obviously had some kind of nervous breakdown, leading to depression, and he'd barely even gone outside for the past few weeks. He evidently wasn't dealing very well. Then right as things kind of calm down and the shouting in the background dies down, I just hear the woman blurt out, "Oh my God, he's got a gun," in the middle of a sentence. I keep asking her, "Ma'am, who has the gun? Tell me who has the gun." And she tells me she saw her husband walking down the hall out to where the son was, and she'd seen his .38 revolver glinting in his hand. And herein lies why dispatch can be so traumatic. I know something awful is about to happen. Once some people get going, there's no stopping them, so my priority here is to preserve human life as best I can until the actual marked units arrive on scene. In the calmest, most mechanical voice possible, I tell her to not try and get in the way, but to find cover and stay put. The ideal place being a porcelain bathtub if the family owns one. You have no idea how many lives porcelain tubs have saved over the years. I had one coworker call them bathroom bunkers, and it stuck. When it's clear she understands my instructions, I radio into my police units and tell them to go full code 3, lights, sirens, door kicking mode, while telling my ambulance to stage nearby. This is standard practice to ensure that medical units aren't hurt. If we have an EMT go down at a scene somewhere, God, that's a whole can of worms I don't even want to think about. When I get back to the call, it's almost totally quiet now. I ask the woman what's happening, and she tells me that she too can't hear anything, and that she even thought it might have calmed down once the son had seen his dad's gun. I hear her say, "Do you think I should check on them?" And I'm right in the middle of telling her to stay put when, bang, I hear this horrible scream of no down the phone, and all of a sudden the woman bursts into tears. I know the worst has happened, and all I can do is inform my officers that there have been shots fired at the scene. By this time, they're both on scene and grabbing their long guns from their trunks, and as they approach the house, they can hear both the dad yelling and the son groaning in pain from around the family garage. And they come around to the front of the garage where it was clear both men were, and notice that there's a small keypad, presumably with a code to open it. I get the code from the wife and pass the information to my officers, listening as they plug the code in before the distinct sound of the garage door raising can be heard. I can't even tell you how fast my heart was racing as I heard those doors slowly rising. Any second, I'm expecting to hear a torrent of gunfire exchanged between the shooter and the officers. I was convinced someone was going to die that night, and I'm keyed up to send in another unit of EMTs, but there's nothing, just silence. After what felt like forever, an officer keys up and tells me that they have one guy in custody and one on the gurney. The shooter had just given up as soon as he saw the cops. Somehow the son actually survived, and his dad was arrested for attempted murder. And unbelievably, the argument started because the dad wanted the son to move out. That's all. It was something so small and dumb, but it just escalated and escalated until the father had no problem turning a gun on his own flesh and blood. Back when I worked full-time for the fire department, I used to take the odd shift working the medical side of the 911 dispatch center. Since smartphones have been getting more and more sophisticated, I've heard it's much easier to pin down exact locations. And in the UK, they have this new 3-word system that brings EMTs right on top of your position, should you happen to be stranded somewhere with no recognizable landmarks. I'm almost certain a system such as this is about to be implemented in certain states, but back in 2006, when all anyone had was flip phones and whatnot, finding out exactly where an injured party was could prove extremely difficult. From what I understand, these days you can ping a location to within a few feet of where a call is coming from, but back in the early 2000s, the area was ballooned to square miles. South side or north side of a city, maybe a county, but nothing as accurate as the tech today. So, with that little bit of context established, this is by far the worst 911 call I ever received. I got a call from a cell phone, presumably one of the aforementioned flip phones, and it was a younger girl telling me her mom had fallen and wouldn't wake up. Over the course of several questions, I established that not only has the mom apparently fallen down a flight of uncushioned wooden stairs, but that she didn't seem to have any vital signs whatsoever. This could have simply been because her young daughter simply didn't know what she was looking for or had made a mistake when it came to her breathing or her pulse. But the really alarming thing, the little girl couldn't give us an exact address, and as much as I asked her things like, "Do you have any mail around to read the address off of?" nothing seemed to work. She couldn't find anything, she couldn't remember, and she was beginning to panic. And in a situation where every single second counts, we were burning valuable time. What's worse, all she could say about where she lived was that it's a farm. And given that pretty much all of my district was rural farmlands, her description didn't bring us any closer to saving her mom's life. Working through all the standard questioning, I got to asking how long it had been since her mom fell down the stairs. She told me her mom had fallen just after her favorite TV show had started, and doing the math, I figured out that she'd been down for 30 minutes at the very least. We're taught to remain completely professional in those situations. I mean, I had one regional dispatch trainer tell me, the more robotic you are, the better. The more detached you are, the more lives you'll save. But in that moment, hearing the mom had been out for like a half hour, I felt my heart sinking. It was like an ice block in my chest. It was the toughest time I've ever had trying to keep it together on a call. But as per my training, I just took a deep breath and tried to mechanically work through the problem-solving techniques I'd been taught. I'd asked her the street name, if there were any landmarks, if there was mail in the house, what she could see out of her front door, but the only thing that landed was the landmarks thing, with the girl telling me that her family walked to and from church every Sunday. Walked. So it had to be close, right? Seconds later, my supervisor and law enforcement are scouring a map of our assigned area, marking off every single church within a few miles of working farms. When they'd narrowed it down to a total number of 5 churches that could feasibly be walking distance for a family with small children, we dispatched a unit to each one with specific instructions to go in lights and sirens the whole way. This would give our younger caller a shot at hearing them approaching so we could further coordinate our response. But just keeping in mind that with only 3 fire rescue vehicles, 2 ambulances, and 4 police patrol cars to cover the entire area, tracking down this young girl's location meant we'd be stretching thin the entire time. By trying to save one life, we'd be risking the lives of others. It was a nerve-wracking risk, but one we were willing to take. Thankfully, after hearing some of our frantic calls going out over the radios, a couple of sheriff's deputies and a handful of highway patrol officers volunteered themselves to join the search effort. Bearing in mind that all this had happened, and we were no more than about 15 minutes into the call. I've never seen or heard of such a large-scale response in our county, not on my watch anyway. I mean, we really did go into overdrive as soon as all the circumstances of the call became evident. I remember the 15-minute mark because this is about the time we learned that the phone she was using was a cordless one, and the family kept the phone at the bottom of the stairs, just feet away from the front door. This obviously meant that she'd be able to walk outside to look for lights and listen for sirens, a major breakthrough in our efforts to locate her. There was some added suspense when it seemed like she might not have been able to open the front door, but I thanked God when I heard her say, "I got it." Then, it was just a matter of waiting and hoping she'd heard the sirens in time. I know it's a huge cliche to say that minutes seem like hours or whatever, but I'd never really understood that whole time is elastic concept until then. It really did seem like forever before she heard our sirens, but there was no time to celebrate when she did. We were still faced with the task of figuring out which of our emergency vehicles we could hear. Law enforcement thought fast and had me telling each responder to stop and turn off their sirens before one by one we had them turn them back on so we could determine which one was the closest to her. It turned out to be one of the fire rigs, so we sent everybody to their position and then they spread out to cover the general area, all with their sirens on again. Eventually, one of the state troopers pulled into her street and the girl could see him coming. When the rest of the dispatch center heard me saying, "Okay, run to the fire truck, honey. Go wave to the fire truck," there was a bunch of silent celebration as people punched the air or buried their heads in their hands in relief. As the little girl met the fire truck, the driver was able to relay his position to us and they signaled that her job was essentially done. I stayed on the line while EMTs were guided onto the property, and once they'd arrived, it was adios from us, and all we could do was hope that the mom was okay. Well, it was more like pray by that point, as for all we knew, she had been flatlined for just going on about an hour. However, we heard later that by the time the medical guys got there, the mom was actually awake. She was incredibly disoriented as there was clearly something horribly wrong with her, but she was alive at least. They later found out that she had a broken back, an absolutely horrific break too, and one that might take her more than a year to recover from. The young girl was given a little reward from the police department for her bravery in the call, as she kept calm and did everything we told her to do. I can't say it was anything more than a token, something to take the edge off the traumatic event she'd gone through, but what else can you do? I suppose this has something of a happy ending, though. The mother recovered with no brain or nerve damage, but the recovery process in itself sounded almost as bad as the injury. I suppose the reason I'm telling you all this is to serve a reminder for something very, very important. As someone who's worked as an emergency dispatcher, I really can't stress how important it is for parents to teach their kids the following things. 1. Teach them your first and last names. 2. Get them to learn their home phone number off by heart. 3. Teach them how to make a 911 call, and that's all attached to that. 4. Teach them their home address and zip code. This is by far the most important one. I've lost count of the number of times when this information would have literally saved a life, or at least prevented life-changing damage to health or property. So please, you're not just sparing some 911 dispatchers' nerves, you might have been saving your own life, or those of your family members. Turn it into a game somehow. Heck, get creative, turn it into a song. But please, teach your kids their home address and teach them how to ask for police, ambulance, or fire.
Now this happened in my senior year of high school when I was 17 years old, about to turn 18. I'm a 5'3", 90-pound female who, from a very early age, has been lusted over by much older men. So by 17 years old, I had been experiencing it for 6 years now. So by that age, I was already very used to the really creepy gazes that I would randomly receive out in public. But Mr. B, he always gave me more than just a gaze. Though I moved around often and went to very many different schools, Mr. B was the first teacher I had who gave me the creeps on a daily basis. I had a sub or two in the past sneak glances at me or even one who gave me his number, but I never saw them again. With Mr. B, however, it was a daily thrill of anxiety as I always wondered what was next, and as you'll see, it would eventually progress beyond school. I had Mr. B first period, and as a senior who had chosen it as a science elective, I was definitely relaxed and I enjoyed talking to my friends often throughout class. As I said, it was supposed to be an elective science class, but he would often ramble off the entire class periods into his specific political and religious views, or just play an unrelated war movie as he had talked to me and my group of friends. Imagine walking into a room and facing 12 o'clock and Mr. B facing towards the door, while the rest of the seats are in front of him facing 3 o'clock. The flag was at like 10 o'clock, so when we did the pledge, we had to stand up and turn around. That'll become relevant later. With the way the seats were, I sat almost directly in front of him, slightly to his right at the back of the class. For whatever reason, he would often intervene in my group's conversations, but no one else's. He would comment on our appearances, which we would always share really blatantly weirded out looks at him. My main 2 friends and I were the weird kids, so all 3 of us were all pretty much in black. I had long red hair, light blue contacts, piercings, and often wore super tall heels. He would always compliment me and tell me how much older I looked, and as the awkward person I was, I would kinda just laugh and thank him and keep my eyes down. Soon during the pledge, he would scoot almost 5 feet over towards me that he could genuinely have his entire left side pressed against my right side as we did the pledge. He would often keep glancing at me and smiling at me as he would do it, sometimes leaning on me so much that I would almost topple over. But because of the design of the room, as I explained before, this left the entire class behind us, and with them all completely able to see this going on. It was because of this that I somehow justified it in my mind that maybe it was okay. I mean, if it was really a big deal, he wouldn't be doing it in front of the entire class like that, right? But it would continue to progress. The pledge thing became a daily occurrence, and even though my friends thought it was weird, they really liked Mr. B. I mean, we had virtually no work in that class, so I just kept my thoughts to myself. He began having us do these really super basic posters because he said it needed some assignments to put in, and as we pushed the tables into groups of 4, with everyone leaning over and working on them, he would slide his body against mine, completely pressed against me for way too long, letting his hand linger on my lower back as he passed. Or sometimes while we sat in class watching all the videos, he would tend to pass me and stop behind me, resting his hand on top of my head for a moment and then running his fingers all through my hair, before then returning to his seat. The first time he did that, I actually completely froze and whipped my head around in disbelief, but no one else noticed and he had this really weird smirk on his face. I had so much other stuff going on with me beyond that class with him that I didn't really think about it that much at first. But then Mr. B began staring me down in the hallway, to the point that my own twin commented on it before I even told her everything that had been happening. It was only when she said that when I told her everything. She agreed that what he was doing wasn't right and that she got bad vibes from him as soon as she saw the way he looked at me. But the looks in the hall or even the touching in class wouldn't have made me post this here. It's when I began seeing him more outside of school that he caught more of my attention. So I worked at a gas station by myself after school right down the road from the high school, and often until close, and I would also be there on the weekends. As I said, I talked to a few of my friends in the class, and I think this is how he found out so much about me. On the very same day that my job got brought up during class, Mr. B showed up at my gas station later that afternoon, filling up his pump. As the bell chimed when he strutted in the gas station, he smiled wickedly at me from over the counter and asked me a ton of questions. How I liked working there, if it was safe, if I got asked out a lot, etc. I frowned at the latter question, and I told him honestly that a lot of creepy men were constantly hitting on me. I unblinkingly stared at him for a moment, trying to get my point across, but he didn't notice. He was full on leaning over the counter with his elbows on the counter looking at me when one of my regulars then walked in. He immediately straightened and he told me he'd see me tomorrow. my regular approach with raised eyebrows in question as I just rolled my eyes as he asked, an admirer? I snort and reply flatly, no, he's my teacher, to which the guy makes a pained face and wags a finger at me as he says, you be good now. You don't want anyone losing a job for you. Before I can reply something snarky back, he walks out laughing. Mr. B began to frequent the gas station pretty much weekly, and he would stare at me shamelessly with that same smirk every time. He would ask me about college, where I was going, what I wanted to do, pretty normal questions. He would also brag to me about how much he loved playing guitar, and that sometime I should check out his band, and that it seemed like my type of music. And every time he came in, he would look to the left, then to the right, stare down at me, and then dramatically ask, do you know all the things that could happen to you alone in here? I would assure him that I was safe and that I had a baseball bat and a panic button, to which he'd just shake his head and then say, that wouldn't stop me if I really wanted someone. He would come so frequently that at one point during the weekend, one evening my stepmother was there, unbeknownst to him, and he then came in and said something like, do you know just how much trouble a girl like you could cause a grown man? And then referencing the song playing on the radio, he added, you make a grown man cry. To which my stepmother stepped out of the back and snapped, excuse me? What does my daughter do to grown men? To which he paled and stumbled over his words, apologizing, and said that she misheard him, and without further explanation, he then left, giving me a look. My stepmother badgered me about it until I explained that he was one of my teachers, and she got a really serious look, then asking, really, Vic? Your teachers too? To which I quickly said back, I don't know what to tell you. He's the only one who hits on me, and the topic was dropped from there. When Monday came, Mr. B had asked me if that was really my stepmom, to which I then said yes, and he laughed and said out loud enough for the whole class to hear. Not a great first impression, I have to admit. Things just continued to progress throughout the year. Seniors got out close to a month before the rest of the school, so with only a few days left, I was really enjoying the time I had left with my friends in that class, especially since they wouldn't be graduating yet. To get my scholarship, I had to do community service hours, and one thing I did towards earning those hours was being the captain of a Relay for Life team. I didn't make the shirts, but because my shirt had captain with my last name on it, Mr. B began darkly saying, "Oh Captain, my Captain," anytime I passed him, and he'd laugh. I was selling baked goods with my team at a small motorcycle festival in my town. It had monthly car shows and alike that we do this at, so I mean, it's not really as weird as it sounds. Anyway, at my last event, there was Mr. B with a group of 4 other men looking to be around his age. He was holding a beer and was staring at me before I noticed him. They all began blatantly calling out for me, and Mr. B just smirked and watched me. The rest of the day, he and his friends just stared at us, and when my friend and I had to go get change, he and his friends were just staring us down like prey, loudly hooting and laughing. I turned to see them all with eyes trained on us, Mr. B with the same wicked look. On our way back with the change, he ushered me over, but with it getting dark and him being with a group of men that I didn't even know, I just blatantly shook my head no and kept glancing back as I headed back to my stand. I could hear them all laughing so hard at that. It was finally my last day of high school a few days later, so I was really elated to finally be free. I'm going through my shift after my last day of class on autopilot, when I then hear the sound of a motorcycle engine. I had been restocking the shelves when I heard it. Now, I had a crush on one of my customers who rode a bike, so I immediately got excited thinking it was him. My face must have dropped dramatically as Mr. B then walked in, only feet away from me. Jesus, Victoria. Just because I'm not your teacher anymore doesn't mean you should look so sad. I just shake my head embarrassedly, apologizing, hoping someone else will walk into the gas station to diffuse the awkwardness of this conversation. I try to scurry around him to get behind the counter, but he steps in my way and actually reaches towards my face, pulling on my head to try to make eye contact with him. I step backwards, almost falling into the shelving as I do. Mr. B instantly stumbles forward and practically knocks me over, pretending to catch his balance as he grips me and holds me to him. He holds me there for a moment as I push away, trying to get him off. Mr. B is easily almost a foot taller than me, and he then smiles down at me, then saying, "Not so tough without those killer heels on, huh, little girl?" It's when he asks that I can practically see unsurety of what to do next across his face. He pulls me back and studies me, and as cowardly as it sounds, I'm frozen in place, unable to pull away. He moves his hands from my wrist up to my shoulders, and then lightly shaking me and whispering, "Really bad things will happen to a girl like you in a situation like this." And with that, he lightly pushes me back, and I scurry back over to my counter. And after a really long silence of watching me, he laughs and leans over the counter again, and finally orders $1.69 worth of gas onto a pump, even though he's not even pulled up to it. And as I hand him the receipt, he holds onto my hand, not letting go. He then says, "My first name is Ryan. If you ever want to message me on Facebook, we could listen to music and have some fun. And you," he says, looking me up and down, "be safe, Captain Red. You never know what can happen." He laughs again and actually squeezes my hand before walking out and revving up his bike. He looks at me through the glass door and actually has the audacity to blow me a kiss. He never got the gas. I was really afraid that wouldn't be the last of him, but it was. He came off and on during the summer before I left, but I worked the evenings and we were so busy we actually had 2 people working at a time, so he never said anything provocative ever again. Looking back, I really wish I would have said something. But so many people liked him, and as I said before, he would make it seem okay by doing it in front of the class. He only focused his attention on me in that class, and I don't know why. I wasn't even the best looking girl in the class. I haven't been back to that area since I moved for college a few years ago, and I really don't know if I'll ever go back, because I met so many creepy people there. From what I've been told, he never went to that gas station again after I stopped working there. I know this doesn't sound that bad, but when it becomes something that I had to stress about every single day, and then seeing him randomly at work and elsewhere, it becomes unreal. So Mr. B, I really hope you never did that to anyone else. Please keep your hands to yourself, and seriously, I never ever want to see you again.
This happened in 2005. Me and my older brother lived with our single mom. I was a freshman in high school and my brother a senior. We had a pretty normal life. Our mom made good money as a lawyer and me and my brother were happy. But one day, one of my mom's cases put our whole family in danger. My mom, being a lawyer, often prosecuted people in our city. In this case, she was prosecuting a man who had assaulted a woman. The man was found guilty and given 20 years in prison. Little did we know the son of this man went to me and my brother's high school. The family was very angry at my mother, especially the son, Kevin. He vowed to make my mom's life a living hell. Me and my brother knew nothing about this though. Our mom never talked about her work with us, and threats are nothing new for lawyers, so no one thought anything of it. On the day it happened, it was like any other. I, being a shy and introverted girl, always went to the bathroom when no one else was using the stalls. This was a mistake. Our school walls were actually made out of glass, so anyone in the classroom could see you walking through the hallway. I know I hate the idea as well. Kevin must have seen me that day as I was walking to the bathroom. I was playing on my phone in one of the stalls when I heard the door crack open. Usually I'd brush it off as another girl who needed to fix her hair or use the bathroom. But this time something felt off. A feeling of dread and fear welled up in me, and instinctively I pulled my feet up off the ground. They laughed and whispered my last name maliciously, and almost instantly I knew he was a boy, and almost instantly it got worse. He started banging his hands on the stalls, slowly getting closer towards mine. Now absolutely terrified, my mind raced with horrific thoughts of what he would do to me. Blinded with fear, I made a horrible decision to run past him towards the door. I jumped out of the stall and sprinted as fast as I could. This unfortunately didn't work. He cut me off and pushed me into the tile floor. What I looked up to still haunts me to this day. Kevin standing above me, his face covered with a vicious smile. I stood up meekly and took a step back. What do you want? I managed to whimper out, my face now covered in tears. He didn't answer. He just took one intimidating step forward and pulled out a small knife. The next part is a bit of a blur. He said something about not screaming and tried to back me up against the wall. Unfortunately for him, I kicked and screamed and punched, though I don't think it did much. I was a small, scrawny 105-pound 14-year-old girl, while he was a giant 17-year-old football player. I don't think I would have gotten away if it wasn't for the fact that we were in a bathroom. Two girls walked in the midst of the chaos, giggling and talking. Through their screams and Kevin's surprise, I was able to bite onto Kevin's hand and escape his grasp. I ran into the bathroom screaming and crying for help, my first thought being to run to my older brother's English room. I trudged down the hallway slowly. Now that my adrenaline had gone down, I realized another danger. A hole in my shoulder and lower stomach was gushing blood. I hadn't felt it until now, but it seemed through our struggle Kevin had stabbed me with his knife. Kids and teachers were now peering through the glass and coming out into the hallway to see what was happening. The two girls who had saw us in the bathroom were screaming, drawing a crowd. I started getting confused in the crowd of kids. My vision was getting blurred, and I felt lightheaded, the loss of blood probably affecting me. Everyone was screaming and running around, and the teacher's attempts to calm everyone was failing. Luckily, I found my brother through this. If I hadn't, I might have died. Running into him, he grabbed my shoulder, making me look up. This part is also a blur, but my friends and brother told me what happened next. My brother told me I had slumped over onto the ground right as I found him. My best friend also in the hallway told me my brother had yelled something like, "Help! My sister is bleeding!" This got the attention of everyone, and some teachers ran over to me and my brother. Students started calling 911 as a teacher and my brother tried to stop the bleeding. My brother has a big temper, so he started yelling at everyone and asking who had done this. The girls thought Kevin might still be in the bathroom, so my brother ran over there. I wish my brother hadn't gone to the bathroom, though, because all of the other kids followed him. Kevin apparently hadn't moved from the spot near the wall, and he hadn't even tried to hide the knife. My brother then proceeded to try and beat up Kevin. Luckily, though, classmates held him back. I was taken to the hospital, and Kevin was arrested. Kevin had actually damaged some organs when he stabbed me near my bladder, so I had to have immediate surgery with only a 40% chance of survival. They then put me in an induced coma because of the pain, and so I wouldn't rip any equipment connected to my body. I survived, but was in a coma for a month. When I was taken out of the coma, it was a tough recovery, partly because of the coma, but also because of the trauma of almost being stabbed to death. The school had covered up the story by the time I woke up. No one was allowed to talk about it, but the kids spread rumors anyways. I decided to recover for the rest of the year before going back to school, and then I returned to my everyday life. Though things have not been the same since that experience, my brother became really overprotective, and my mom quit her job, and Kevin was never seen again. I also have had recurring nightmares of Kevin since the incident. Now that I'm an adult, things have settled down for our family. And you know what? Even though Kevin tried to kill me and put me in a coma, I hope he's got himself figured out now. He obviously needed help, and none was given to him. Kevin, if you hear this, answer this question. Are you afraid of knives now? Because I'm afraid of bathrooms. I went to high school with a guy, Bob. Bob and I were never close, but we sometimes hung out in the same circle. He was in band and I was in drama. Bob was always a little off. I think he may have had a learning disability, and maybe that resulted in him being socially awkward. Anyway, by sophomore year, he was dating a friend of mine, so I saw more of him. By junior year, he dropped out and tried to get his GED. That was the last I heard of Bob, for a while at least. Fast forward to the summer 2 years after graduating. Bob calls me up out of the blue and asks me to go camping with him and a friend of his that I don't know. He says that he knows a spot that is totally secluded and that we would be hiking 5 miles a day. He really tries to sell me on this.
He insists that it'll be awesome and fun and that we'll bond. As I listen to him, something from the pit of my stomach says, no, don't do this. Never being especially close to him and not having seen him for 2 years, I thought that it was weird for Bob to call me up, and I declined his offer. The following November, Bob is on the news because he had killed his partner. He worked for an armored van service and stolen the money in the armored van. There were news updates about him fleeing out of the state. He was finally caught on a routine traffic stop, I believe. Anyway, when his case went to trial, his journal was entered into evidence. The prosecutor said that Bob wrote that he and his friend, the same one that was going to go camping, hatched a plan to become professional assassins. I believe that the camping trip he invited me on was all a ruse so that he could get me in a secluded place so that he and his friend could practice how to murder someone, namely me.
For some context, I'm a 23-year-old female, but at the time of this story I was 19 years old and in my second semester of college. The college that I went to was in Monterey Bay, California. It was a big campus, but most of the students were all spread out throughout the buildings. At the time, I lived on campus in the dorms that were located in the middle of campus where all the freshmen lived. I had just finished my anthropology class with my friend and we were walking back to our dorms. She lived in the hall right across from mine. They were separated by 2 doors and stairs on the 3rd floor, so eventually we would split off. Each door can only be unlocked with the student ID of those who live in the building. This is important for later. We were approaching our building when a man had started yelling for us to stop. We waited, but we had kept an eye on him while we watched him approach. I'm a bit of an uneasy person whenever I meet new people, so I always size up people that I meet. This man was slender and short, but slightly taller than me, with dark messy brown hair and black circles under his eyes. He seemed off to me, so I remained cautious. He didn't have any books or a backpack on him, but he was holding a clipboard with a pencil. He started saying that he was approaching girls with a study he was conducting, that when someone is experiencing a loss, they can then feel better when they get the numbers of pretty women. Now, I'm a psychology major, so I kinda just laughed it off in my head. We both said sorry and no thanks, but he kept on persisting. Again we said no, but this time we actually mentioned that we both had boyfriends, so we didn't feel okay about it. I turned away a bit slower than my friend. As we began to walk away, his face turned to anger, and he actually reached to grab my friend's arm. Now the thing to know here is not only am I uneasy around strangers, but anytime I go anywhere I always have a pocket knife on me. It didn't take me very long to flick it out at the guy when I then stood in between him and my friend. The surprised look on his face told me that he didn't expect one of us to get defensive about him grabbing us, but he still just stood there watching me. I then told my friend to run to the stairs. It didn't take her long to get to the top, and she had her keycard fully ready to unlock her door. I told him if he followed either of us, I wouldn't hesitate to use my knife on him. I slowly backed away and then bolted up the stairs. He took a few steps towards the stairs, but I had my card out and I was already inside the hall before he could do anything, and so was my friend. When I finally got into my dorm room, I slid down my door and then just shook for about 15 minutes. I eventually made my way to class and I explained everything that happened to my professor. She told me to email my RA and have my friend do the same. After class was over, I went straight to my room and sent the email. My friends and I decided from that day on that we would always walk together everywhere. Nobody went anywhere alone. 2 days later, there was a school-wide email alert. The guy that had confronted us wasn't even a student at all. He had apparently been stalking girls to their dorms and then trying to get into their rooms. University police were looking for him, but to my knowledge, he was never found. I never went anywhere on campus alone without a knife, and my friend got pepper spray so that if I wasn't there, she had something to defend herself. I don't want to even imagine what would have happened if I wasn't prepared, or if either of us was alone. I just don't want to think about it. This happened when I was in college. It was a warm Sunday evening in June, and my friend Joanne and I decided to go for a walk. We had seen a play on campus the night before, Saturday, and a friend of ours named Lee was supposed to be attending the performance that night on Sunday. Since we had already seen the production, we knew what time it was ending and we hoped to surprise Lee. But we waited and he never came out. It turned out that something had came up and he had not gone to the show after all. Disappointed, we started back home. We walked up this hill from the theater, and as we turned around the corner, we noticed a college-aged white guy in a white t-shirt and blue jeans leaning against a tree. It definitely looked suspicious because this was 10:30 at night. As we passed by that guy in the tree, the guy started following us. We sort of tensed up, not really sure what to do. Since it was summer, the college was hosting a cheerleading camp for high school girls. A large group of cheerleaders was coming back from some event and they were not very far ahead of us. I suggested to Joanne that we follow those girls to the dorm they were staying in, wait there for a few minutes until this guy left, and then we could head on back to our dorm. We stayed at the cheerleaders' dorm until we were sure the guy must be gone. Then we headed out. When we started up the hill going toward our dorm, we looked back and we realized to our horror, the guy had waited for us and he was now following us yet again. We started to panic, not knowing what to do. There was a part of our walk where we had to pass by dorms which were unoccupied since it was summer. If he was still following us at that point, there would be no one who could hear us or see us, and who knows what he would have done to us then. We had no choice though. We had to go by that deserted area in order to get back to our dorm. It was at that point that I remembered a TV show that I'd seen on Friday just 2 days before, where a police officer shared what to do if you're ever being followed. He said that what the perpetrator is counting on is the element of surprise. So if you're being followed, you should then turn around so you're directly facing them, plant your feet firmly, and just stare hard at them. It lets the person know that you're very aware of them and that you're standing your ground. And that's exactly what I did. I spun around, crossed my arms with my feet firmly planted, and stared hard at the guy. Amazingly, it actually worked. The guy stopped, not knowing what to do, then gradually backed off, finally turning around and then leaving. I stayed where I was until he was finally out of sight. Then Joanne and I ran as fast as we could until we were finally safely back in our dorm. We didn't go for any late night walks after that. I thank God that I had seen that program 2 days before. It really saved us from God knows what. This story is told from the perspective of a male. Back when I was a sophomore in college at a college in Ohio, my friend and I were invited to a girl's house to drink a few cold ones. We weren't old enough to go to the bars yet, so we had said why not and then headed over. I should mention that back in the neighborhoods behind campus where the majority of students live is really notorious for people getting jumped and mugged late at night. However, my friend and I were in really great shape and we were the typical college meatheads, so we didn't really worry about this too much. Anyways, we get there with our typical 24-pack of Natty Light and see there are 4 girls but no guys sitting on the front porch. Pretty good ratio if you ask me. We threw our beers in the fridge inside and then joined them on the front porch. The beer was flowing nicely that night and we were all having a really great laugh. It was really shaping up to be a really great night. It had been about 2 hours and I was pretty buzzed, but I wanted to keep it going. I announced that I was going inside to grab another beer and my friend said he would go with me. I can't really remember what we had said inside, probably just who we wanted to take home for the night, but we were literally inside for not more than like 30 seconds. We step outside and literally all 4 of the girls are all crying. One of them was laying down by the sidewalk. We asked them what happened and they had then indicated that about 4 guys with their face covered had actually ran up on them and robbed them. They apparently had airsoft guns and when one of the girls wouldn't give her purse, they dragged her down the steps until she let go of it. My friend and I were so pissed off that this happened right under our noses. These guys must have been hiding and watching us for a really long time and were waiting for the right opportunity to have the girls alone. I can't really say how this would have gone if we were on the porch when this had occurred, but I'm sure there would have been a fight. The cops were called and they took all our statements, but of course never heard any follow-up. The girls all canceled their cards shortly afterwards and they had to get new everything, which is a real pain in the ass. A lesson learned with this is to never leave females alone late at night in that kind of environment. I actually got my own sister pepper spraying a stun gun when she went off to college, just so something like this never happens to her. So did the 4 cowards who waited till I went inside to attack the women. Be very glad we never met.
When I was as young as 14, I started working at various gas stations in my town. My town was small. Everyone knew pretty much everyone, so the owners wouldn't care if I came in and helped out with stuff like mopping the floors, stocking the coolers, or even running the register at times, all for a small amount of cash. This all took place back in the early 90s in Florida. It was maybe 11 p.m. at night, and I was sitting at my usual spot at a table that was set up along the windows of the gas station. I would generally spend most of the nights at that table reading books and periodically getting up to do different chores. Now, being only 14, I obviously wasn't allowed to be the only one running the store at any given time. It would usually be me and a manager, or maybe another employee or two. And this night, it was me and a guy named Jeff. Jeff was one of the part-time managers, and usually when it was only me and him, he would spend most of his time in the back, which basically left me to hold down the store by myself. This night was no different. I remember sitting at the register when I glanced up. Something had caught my attention that was especially odd. I could see a lady who was walking up our parking lot from the direction of the interstate. Like, there were literally no customer cars in the parking lot. Now, this in itself was weird, as because of where we were located, we would get almost nobody that would walk here, especially not from the direction of the interstate. I mean, the store was practically in the middle of nowhere along a very desolate interstate. Nobody just walks this road. I figured she must have broken down somewhere, and was coming up to fill a gas container, or use the phone to call for a tow truck or something. After around a minute of me watching her, I realized she didn't have a container in her hands. She then came into the store and looked around for a few minutes. The whole situation just felt off. I remember getting a strange and disturbing vibe from her, just from the way she was looking around the store. By this point, Jeff had come out from the back and was standing behind the register with me. He would occasionally do this when customers came in. The lady then walked up to the counter and started telling us a story about how her car had broken down and that she needed a ride to some town I had never heard of before. Jeff promptly responded, saying that he was working and that there was no way he could take her, as he was the manager and couldn't leave me here alone. That's when the lady turned to look at me, as if to get my response. Before saying anything, I looked back at Jeff, who looked at me with a very cold and hard stare, subtly shaking his head as if to say no. And that was my assurance that I knew that he knew something was off about this lady. Now, before I could respond, she turned back to Jeff and pointed at me, asking if I could take her. Jeff quickly and sternly responded that I was too young to drive, and said there was no way we could help her. I obviously didn't argue with Jeff about his response on my behalf, as to be quite honest, this was completely out of character for him. Jeff was normally friendly and even chatty with the customers, and this further supported the fact that Jeff knew something was off about this lady. The lady, now clearly infuriated, cussed us out and left. As she walked back down the parking lot, I kept an eye on her. I noticed she had stopped at the end of the parking lot, right next to the interstate itself. I also noticed she was now on a phone call, and waited for maybe 2 minutes when a car pulled up, stopped right next to her, and let her in as if the car was expecting her. The whole situation was weird, yeah, but I never truly realized how much danger I was actually in that night, until a while later. Almost a year passed. It was night, and I was in my bedroom falling asleep as the TV was on in the background. I don't know what channel it was on, possibly some news channel or something, but regardless, something I heard on the TV snapped me wide awake. I sat up to look at the TV, and was greeted with the mugshot of a lady on the screen. As soon as I saw her, I immediately knew. That was the same lady that I had been in the store with almost a year prior, and who tried to lure either me or my manager to drive her into town. I was 100% sure that was the same woman. It turns out the lady was Eileen Warnos, who was later convicted of being a serial murderer with a confirmed 7 victims who were all men. Eileen would lure her victims out into the middle of nowhere, and that's where she would shoot them at point-blank range. What disturbs me most is how close I was to becoming one of those victims myself. From both the way she acted in the store and what I now know about her, I firmly believe her plans were to kill either me or my manager Jeff that night. To this day, I still have nightmares about what would have happened had we done what she said. This happened to me and my wife back in the summer of 2017. We had actually only gotten married a few months prior, and obviously because of the wedding costs, our financial situation wasn't the best. And this made it so that we could only afford a place to live that was super cheap and that would let us pay week to week. But luckily, we were able to find just that in the form of a boarding house in our city. The house was 3 stories and had 4 rooms, with a shared kitchen and a bathroom for everyone. We moved into one of the rooms on the 2nd floor. Now, obviously with it being a boarding house, we had to share with a few other people. The most noteworthy ones being a young couple named Jim and Jennifer just above us in a room on the 3rd floor. And in the 3 months we lived there, they were the only neighbors we talked to. They seemed similar to us in both age and interests, but we usually just talked to them in passing, or even sometimes on the front porch, where we were all out having a cigarette. Though, after a few weeks, we would quickly realize that they didn't get along too well. It started off with small things, like hearing them yell at each other for short durations of time, or hearing one of them angrily leave the house in some absurd hour of the night. But the short fights didn't last long. They would get only longer and louder as time went on. Though, that was until one day. My wife and I were watching a movie, and the whole time the usual fights were taking place just above us. But right as the movie ended, we both noticed they abruptly stopped. Don't get me wrong, it was nice to finally have peace and quiet, but it was completely out of character for them. I mean, this never happened. They would almost never just abruptly stop yelling at each other, especially at this point in the night. Though, even still, we both agreed that we should take advantage of the silence and try to go to sleep. And luckily we were able to. But just for me to be woken up in the middle of the night by my wife who was shaking me and looking off toward the side of our bed. I was tired and completely out of it. I didn't know what time it was, or why I was being woken up. Out of habit, I turned over to get up. But when I did, I could make out a man standing right next to our bed, hunched over my nightstand going through the drawer. I was in absolute disbelief. After locking eyes, he stood up from his hunched position and proceeded to just stare at me. I sat up on my bed, and the guy started backing up slowly. I honestly didn't know if what I was seeing was real or just my imagination, but after turning on our room's lamp, I realized it was our upstairs neighbor Jim, the same one who was always yelling and keeping us up late. I was a little relieved, but still, why was he going through our stuff while we were sleeping? It was completely out of character for him. After calming down for a second, I said, "What's up, Jim? What are you doing in our room, man?" After a few seconds of silence, Jim responded by asking if he could borrow our car, or if we could take him somewhere. My wife, who was now fully awake, screamed at him no, not after he broke into her room at 3 in the morning. She told him that if he didn't leave, she was going to call the cops. And Jim responded to this by full-on sprinting out of the room. But not just the room, the dude full-on ran out the front door and down the street in a seemingly random direction. I looked at my wife, and we both agreed that something was clearly off about the whole situation. We figured at this point we had to go upstairs and check on Jim's wife Jennifer. And so we do. We go upstairs, and the first thing we notice is the door to the room was shut, but it wasn't locked. I told my wife we should probably just leave her alone, but she insisted against it. So I reluctantly knocked and shouted the usual hello. After no response, we slowly turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. What we saw next was straight out of a horror movie. The room looked terrible, as if someone had just gone crazy hitting random areas with an axe. That's when we noticed Jennifer lying on the floor face down. We walked over to her, thinking that Jim had knocked her unconscious. But as we got closer, we realized there was fresh blood staining the carpet underneath her. In complete horror, we called the cops immediately. We explained to them that we believed we had just walked into a murder scene, but that the murderer himself had already left. The police would tell us to leave the room and wait outside until they arrived. And sure enough, they would arrive not even 5 minutes later. After explaining everything that happened that night, the cops set out a search for Jim, and luckily they were able to find him around an hour later still running down the street. After further talking with the cops, they said it looked like Jim was trying to find a gas station so that he could get fuel to help him burn the whole house down, with the goal of burning Jennifer's dead body inside. This in turn would remove all evidence connecting him to the murder, though Jim would ultimately be convicted with the murder of his own wife. For the next couple of days, both me and my wife couldn't leave the house, as every time we tried, we would be swarmed by different news reporters asking us for an interview. Me and my wife would of course move out as soon as we found the funds to do so, but still, the whole thing was insanely terrifying. I mean, in the middle of the night, we had unknowingly come face to face with a man who had just murdered his own wife, and who was ultimately planning to murder us in the process of destroying the evidence. This happened 2 years ago, when I was working for a very large carpet cleaning company. It's exactly what you'd expect. I'd spend the whole workday going from house to house, completely deep cleaning the residents' carpets with a lot of different tools and machinery. I was 22 and a female. I'm actually pretty sure I was one of the only females working for this company, but at the same time I really enjoyed it, and if I'm being honest, I was actually really good at the job. So, because of this, I was given a lot of work, and would usually hit between 6 to 8 houses daily, driving all across multiple towns. This night, I was working late, as one of the houses I cleaned earlier in the day took way longer than expected, which of course sent me back the rest of the day. I'd say it was around 7 p.m. when I had one house left to do for the day. Though, upon arrival at the given address, I quickly realized it was in the middle of nowhere. And after knocking on the front door, I also realized no one was home. I was annoyed, yeah, but realistically I was the one that was late for the appointment. I decided to wait until someone came home, as I knew I'd get chewed out by my boss if I left without cleaning anything. And luckily, 10 minutes later, the resident pulled up next to my van. He was a middle-aged man, balding, wearing dirty shorts and a jacket. He honestly seemed a bit awkward, but was apologetic and let me into his house with all my needed equipment. Upon entering, I instantly realized the carpet and just the house in general was already unbelievably clean. I mean, it even smelled like cleaning supplies had just been used. To be honest, it was a little weird. I wasn't used to seeing already clean carpets upon arrival. I was genuinely questioning whether me cleaning them would even make a difference. But regardless, I followed protocol and pulled out my company laptop to calculate how much it was going to cost before starting. "Hey, do they keep track of where you are on that thing?" His question caught me off guard. That was an immediate red flag. After the initial shock from the question, I replied saying that it did, and that my boss knew exactly how long each job should take. In reality, this was a complete lie. The laptop was literally just used to run a program that can calculate how much to charge a customer based on the inputted amount of work. But I felt like I had to lie, as there was definitely something off about this guy. Regardless, I started cleaning. I just figured the quicker I could clean these carpets, and the quicker I could get out of here and call it a day. Fast forward around an hour later, and I was finished. I hastily met up with the guy to explain I was done and how much he owed me. But before I could, he interrupted me. He asked me if I could also clean his basement carpets, as he forgot to list them when he ordered the service. My heart literally dropped. I just wanted to be done with this and get out of here. But my stupid customer service conditioned brain couldn't figure out how to get away with saying no. The guy led me to his basement door, opened it, and gave me a hand signal as if to gesture that I was to go down first. I hesitated, but ultimately I did. Once I got to the bottom, I was horrified. The basement looked horrible compared to the rest of the house. Not only was it unfinished with no carpet whatsoever, but there were clearly 7 deep freezers lining the walls. In the middle of the room was a lit, low-hanging ceiling light revealing an old television set, VHS tapes scattered all over the floor, and an old recliner facing the TV. Behind the set were 2 white shelves full of VHS tapes. The whole while I'm looking at the basement, the guy stood at the top of the steps blocking the doorway with a disturbing smile on his face. I looked up at him and said, Yeah man, let me go get my stuff. With absolutely no intention of cleaning anything, I just wanted to get out of there. I held my breath and began to walk back up the stairs. The whole while, all I could hear was my own heartbeat in my ears. But as I got to about the third stair from the top, the guy was still blocking the door, with still that disturbing smile on his face. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds, just looking at the guy, waiting for him to get out of the way, when I swear I could hear footsteps in the basement behind me. Out of pure instinct and adrenaline, without even looking back, I charged towards the guy in front of me. Luckily, I was able to break past him, and right as I did, I beelined it out of the front door and into my van parked outside. I was leaving thousands of dollars of cleaning equipment behind. But honestly, in that moment, I didn't care. I legitimately felt like my life was in danger. As I was pulling away, I glanced back at the house one last time, and I saw the same man looking out one of the windows, now with no smile on his face, but rather a cold, hard stare. I thought I could see another person, but I honestly don't know. The whole memory is sort of just a blur. The truth of the matter is that my boss would not have noticed I was missing for at least 24 hours when I didn't show up for my shift the next day. The next morning, I would call my boss, tell him everything, and ultimately quit that very day. As far as I know, they got the police involved, but I try to distance myself from the whole situation, so I really don't know what ended up happening. I suffered PTSD over this experience. That day still haunts me, and to this day, I can't explain what I found in that basement or the sounds of footsteps I thought to have heard behind me. But one thing's for certain. I believe that man, and whoever else was there, had planned to kill me that night for some sick reason or another. This encounter happened back in 2007 when I was 20 years old. I'm a female, and I didn't get my driver's license until January of that year. So now being able to drive myself opened a lot of doors for me. And because of that, I took a lot of solo road trips to my friend's house that was a couple states over. I remember one time specifically, I was driving alone on an interstate on a random day in July on my way to visit my friend for a long weekend. Her parents were away, and we had the house to ourselves and were planning on drinking, hot tubbing, and to overall just have a good time. It was a Friday, and I had left a lot later than I wanted to. Like, it was dark at this point, and being a new driver, driving in the dark made me pretty uneasy. After a few hours, I stopped at a gas station to fill up and get some snacks for the last part of my drive. I was heading into the store when a man, maybe in his early 40s, approached me. He was only around 5 feet tall and had on a plain black tee and jeans with dark brown hair. I noticed he had come out of a black pickup truck and only moments ago parked a few spaces away from my car. The guy had a super intense stare that immediately creeped me out. As he caught up to me, he tried starting a conversation by asking if I was from the area, where I was headed, and if I knew of anything fun to do. I quickly replied with no, shaking him off as just another creepy dude. Though, surprisingly, he then invited me to go play mini-golf or catch a movie with him. Without even looking at him, I declined his invitation and continued towards the store. Quite honestly, I was shocked he asked me to do something with him. The whole vibe was off. It was pretty uncomfortable and just random. As I was entering the store, I could then hear him yell a stern "hey." It was super aggressive and uncalled for, that it even startled a family walking out of the store. Though I just ignored it and continued inside. Shortly after, I could tell the guy followed me. He was clearly staring at me, so I went to use the bathroom and stayed in the stall for at least 10 minutes texting my friend about the guy. Thankfully, when I came out, I couldn't see him in the store anymore. I then went out to put gas in my car, and was again relieved as his black pickup was nowhere to be seen. Though, to my absolute horror, as I was pulling out of the gas station parking lot, I could hear someone persistently honking their horn. I looked in my rearview mirror and I could clearly see the same black pickup behind me. The guy was now shouting and signaling me to pull over to the side. I of course freaked out, stepped on it and pulled onto the on-ramp back onto the highway. But the guy was following me. I called my friend extremely terrified. I drove really fast, and looking back, I'm lucky I didn't get into an accident. The guy didn't follow me for that long, and I think only after a few exits he was gone. Though, even still, the last hours of my drive were extremely tense. I didn't stop for the rest of the trip, and never saw the guy's car again. I remember checking my mirrors constantly the rest of the way. Eventually, I got to my friend's house safely, and we actually had a nice weekend despite the encounter. The whole thing was definitely creepy, but over the years I didn't think too much about it. That was until around 6 years later, when the memory would once again come fresh in my mind. I was talking with another friend of mine who was big into serial killer documentaries and things like that. I remember at one point I had mentioned my encounter, jokingly suggesting that the man I had met was a serial killer, and explained to her my experience. She was fascinated, and therefore wanted to Google active serial killers in the area of where I experienced it all. But the first guy that came up made my heart drop. It was a man named Adam Leroy Lane. I instantly recognized the guy. There was no doubt in my mind, that was the same guy I had encountered at the gas station that night. Both the time and the area were a match. The man had 3 convictions. It was 2 counts of murder and 1 count of assault. This discovery has haunted me ever since, and caused me to be much more cautious in public at night. My heart goes out to the victims of this man and their families. I've been grateful every day since that I didn't become one of them. When I was in my early 20s and fresh out of college, I lived in some pretty sketchy, albeit cheap apartment buildings in the US. Now, something to note is that the walls in my apartment block out almost no sound. And because of this, I would almost always hear my neighbor to the left of me blasting his music. Though, if I'm being honest, it didn't bother me as much as I thought it would. I would just simply play my own music to not hear it as loud. One night, I could tell he had been drinking a lot, simply from the way I could hear him stumbling across his room. I also figured his girlfriend must have been there, as I could hear him practically yelling at her, which unfortunately wasn't all that uncommon. Usually when things get that loud, I try to get away from it all, and seeing as it wasn't that late, I decided to head out for the night with some friends. We went to a few clubs, and overall had a good time. Fast forward to around 1 AM or so, and my friends were dropping me back off at my apartment. Though, as we were driving into the parking lot, in the distance we could see my neighbor outside crouched down in between some cars and the apartment building. Okay, kinda weird, but I figured it was whatever, as the guy was just generally creepy anyway. My friends were clearly more weirded out than I was. I honestly didn't think much of it, and just had them drop me off near the gate entrance, as it would be easier for them to leave the parking lot that way. But as I was walking toward my apartment building, I swear my heart dropped. I noticed my neighbor was now standing perfectly still in one of the bushes that was between 2 of the apartment buildings. As I got closer, it was clear he thought I didn't see him. To break the tension, I waved at him and mumbled a greeting, as I wasn't just going to pretend that I couldn't see him. After doing so, he stepped out of the bush and came into the dim streetlight, not saying a word, but rather just staring at me. Never in my life have I looked into eyes so widened and fully dilated. The whole encounter was disturbing to say the least, but I tried to ignore it and continued into the building. Right as I got to my apartment door, I got inside and went straight to bed. I was exhausted and just wanted to forget everything and go to sleep. Although, all through the night, I could hear thumps and rustling that sounded like furniture moving. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of cops outside banging on my neighbor's door.
New York City Police Department!
I was partially relieved to hear them, but that quickly turned to fear of why they were there in the first place. I could hear them take him away in handcuffs, and shortly after the police started knocking on my door. They asked me when the last time I had talked to or seen him was, and without hesitation, I told the officer everything that had happened the other night. The yelling, the noises, the encounter in the parking lot, and even the rustling sounds all night. But what I was told next will forever haunt me. I was told that my neighbor had brutally murdered his girlfriend that night. They said he dragged her body outside and into a nearby ditch behind the apartment buildings. And that's when I realized that the other night I was looking at a person who had just taken another human being's life. honestly felt terrible for the woman. To this day, what disturbs me most is how close I was to death, quite literally, and how he could have ambushed me out of insanity, since he was just waiting in the darkness when I walked up. I moved into a different apartment in a better part of town shortly after the occurrence. I'm a female and 22 years old. I just recently got out of a pretty abusive relationship, and honestly, I wasn't in the best place mentally because of it. If I'm being real, it was difficult for me to now have to go home each night to an empty apartment with just myself. Anyways, this night my friends had decided to take me to a hockey game to get me out of the house and potentially get my mind off of the breakup. It was a Friday night, and we had been consuming a decent amount of alcohol during the progression of the game. In the arena we were attending, there was this bar where you could buy as many drinks as you wanted, within reason of course. And following the game, we decided to head there for a few more before we left. It was a busy night, so especially considering the game was coming to a close, the line was decently long. During the duration of the time I was patiently waiting, I had started to speak with a couple guys right next to me. Shortly into the conversation, one of them spoke up and asked for my phone number. Looking back, I definitely should have said no, but in the state I was in, I gave it to them. After we had finally gotten our drinks, my friends and I decided to call it a night. We parted ways, but instead of calling an Uber and going back to my apartment, I very stupidly decided to text the man I had previously exchanged contact information with. He responded almost right away, saying he'd head over in an Uber and take me back to his place if I wanted. Again, I made a stupid decision and agreed. Eventually he showed up, and we were off back to his place. Though, the drive was a good 45 minutes. When we arrived, I quickly realized we were practically in the middle of nowhere. We weren't anywhere close to the city anymore, and as I looked around, I realized no other property was in sight. Quite honestly, without context, I easily would have mistaken his house for an abandoned building. It was that bad. But regardless, being as intoxicated as I was, I quickly disregarded all my suspicion and followed the man to the front door. As we entered, I quickly realized how clean the place looked from the inside. Like, think hospital level clean, even down to the smell. Without even offering, he quickly poured us a glass of seemingly expensive red wine. I thought nothing of it at the time, and from what I remember, he poured it right in front of me and even drank some himself. Though, that was the last memory I had of that night. The next thing I knew, I was in a bedroom with the sun now clearly shining through the window. The noise of a shower running quickly filled my ears. I was groggy and dazed when I woke up, but I slowly began piecing together where I was, who I was with, and just the overall situation I was in. As it came back to me, I realized I needed to leave immediately. I frantically began to search for my cell phone, clothes, and wallet. But it was no use, I couldn't find them. I rushed out of the bedroom in the hopes to just leave unnoticed prior to this man getting out of the shower. But as I was leaving, my heart sank into my stomach. All of the furniture and floors were completely covered with plastic shower curtains, which I distinctly remember not being there prior to me blacking out the night before. I quickly noticed all of my personal belongings were placed neatly on the kitchen counter, alongside a knife that clearly wasn't a kitchen knife, but rather a hunting knife or something like that. My instincts kicked in, and I instantly grabbed my things and ran out the door. I ran for several minutes in a random direction, panicked and full of adrenaline. A good 10 minutes of full-on running down the road, and I finally stopped to call a friend to pick me up and take me back to my apartment. When I got back, I instantly blocked the guy's number, and to this day have never heard anything from him again. Now, looking back, I realize I should have contacted the authorities immediately, but for whatever reason I never did. It's clear I was not in the right state of mind at that point in my life, and this eats away at me daily, as I believe at this point it's too late for me to report the man, seeing as I don't even have the slightest recollection of where his house was located, or even his name. The detail that haunts me the most is that the only thing missing of my personal belongings was my ID. And this makes me question what the guy's true intentions were. Though, if I'm being honest with myself, I truly believe that man planned on murdering me that morning. The plastic shower curtains all over the apartment and the knife make it clear to me. But I guess I'm just lucky to have never truly found out.
I met Matham when I was a freshman in high school back in 2012. We had the same PE period, and during a game of flag football, we were put on the same team. He was cute and funny and a good person to be around, so we became friends pretty fast. Matham was a year older than me, so we didn't have any other classes together and we didn't have the same lunch, but we hung out a lot during PE and eventually exchanged numbers. We would also occasionally hang out before school or walk onto the school grounds together because we arrived around the same time. Our friendship grew rapidly. He asked me out a couple of times, and even though I was attracted to him, I politely declined because I was in a long-distance relationship at the time and didn't want to cheat. Turns out the guy I was dating was a catfish, but that's another story for another time. I don't know when it happened, but eventually we drifted away. He started changing his appearance and didn't really talk to me that much. He hung out with some other groups of friends who I didn't know. We occasionally waved at each other and had brief conversations, but didn't really talk much. Our friendship died, and it was painful for me at first, but with the mental illnesses I had going on and the stress of school, I eventually moved on. Around sophomore year, when he was a junior, we started talking again. We were both trying out for a play and helped each other on their scenes, and we talked about our lives and how school was and everything. We were friends again. He didn't get in the play, but I did, and he came to the show to support me. Things were going good again. Halfway through junior year, I had to move to a different state due to my mom being in the army. It was a very painful move, and I was very depressed and angry. I tried keeping in contact with all of my friends from California, but it was difficult, and I eventually lost contact with most of them, only occasionally talking to them once in a great while. Matham was one of those friends I occasionally spoke to. I often wondered if I should try to reach out more, but I was busy with life, and so were they, and I told myself I could eventually talk to them another day. But Matham wouldn't be there. On April of 2017, Matham was killed by his friend Salvador. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about it, but Salvador put a video on Snapchat with Matham crying and begging for his life. I think Salvador also took a photo of himself wearing bloody clothes. I was floored when I read the news. I didn't know what to do, what to say, how to react. I was heartbroken that a friend I was once so close to was now gone after a violent murder. I was also angry, furious that it happened to him. He was a good person. He didn't deserve a death like that. It's a very strange feeling when someone you knew and were once very close to is suddenly gone. I felt numb, and it felt unreal. It still feels unreal. I'm still angry and sad that this happened, that someone Matham saw as a friend could hurt him and could record audio, hearing him begging, crying, and still end his life. I just don't understand. It's been over a year and I'm still hurting. I have a lot of regret. I wish I had spoken to him more, spent more time with him, been a better friend. I wish there was something I could have done, but I know that would have been impossible for me to do. I didn't know Salvador, and I was thousands of miles away. There was nothing I could have done even if I wanted to, and that makes me angry too. Salvador was sentenced to 25 to life in prison. He tried to plead not guilty due to insanity, but was found sane during the time of the crime. But I feel there's no real closure. There wasn't a reason for the killing. He just did it, and he took my friend away from me, and he took Matham away from his family and friends. I will never get to talk to Matham again. His family will never see him again. His friends will never see him again. He's gone, and Salvador is alive, and it's not fair. I hope he rots for what he did.
I don't view myself as a bad person, but I think people are capable of bad things in times of stress, and I bet most people can relate to this. I'm 15, and I live in Salina, Kansas. And my first year of high school was really rough. I got into fights. I often got jumped throughout the week, and I found myself in more trouble than I'm worth. It was only recently that I was able to get myself back on track. Anyway, let's go back to last Christmas of 2016. It wasn't crazy cold in Kansas that year, so I went on midnight skates like I always do. I was talking to this girl. She had no interest in me. I'd already tried to hit on her before, but she shut me down. Days later of not talking to her, I got a Snapchat from her. And the moment I saw the notification, I was excited. I was a girl-crazy boy back then, just like anyone my age, I guess. When I opened Snapchat, I saw that it was a simple hey, and I wrote back right away. All I could think of to write back was hey, without losing my cool. Her picture, though, was odd, because when she messaged me back, she sent me a picture of her body. I was shocked. I didn't know she was like that. I asked her what that was for, and I even thanked her. Being the excitable teenager I was, probably not the best thing to say at the time. But she didn't give me a response. It was weird. You don't just send someone those kinds of pictures on Snapchat, then disappear. In fact, I didn't hear from this girl after 6 months. The most that would happen was I would walk by her at the high school, but she would pretend I didn't exist. Well, when the next semester started at school, I was still screwing around, not listening, not doing my work, just being a total drag on my own life. But a new girl caught my eye. She had long, straight, beautiful hair, and I thought she was awesome. She ended up being the girl I had my first time with, someone I truly cared about. But we only dated for about 2 months, because due to my behavior, I got kicked out of public school. My grades were terrible, and I just didn't care enough about my work or the teachers who were giving it to me. Not to mention she and I were growing apart, because of some personal drama brewing between my buddies and hers. At my first day at an alternative school, I sent her a simple and painful message, and I tried not to cry as I texted it. I don't think this will work out. I gotta go. You were the greatest thing in a long time for me, but I need to get my act together. I'm sorry. She didn't like that one bit. Throughout my first day, I got dings constantly from my pocket, and when I wouldn't reply to her texts, she began to message me non-stop on Snapchat, as that's always been the next best way to get a hold of me. And as I didn't turn the notifications off fast enough, I had my phone taken away. Yay, I thought. I got home at 3 that day, and by 10 p.m. I was out. I crashed in my bed, but not too long after, something woke me up. It was a notification from Snapchat, a picture with a message, and of course it was from her. It was a message that sent chills down my spine. The picture showed a gun in someone's drawer, and the message read, "If you really do this, if you really think you're going to leave me, then I'll be getting my family together, my mom, my uncle, my stepdad, and we'll meet you at your house, and we'll show you what happens when you hurt someone like me." I was astonished, to say the least, to think that someone I really thought cared would threaten me like that, and I didn't believe it anyway. I ignored it, and I went to sleep. As per usual, I woke up in the morning, took my shower, went to school, ignored the other kids who didn't really like me. Same old, same old. And when I got home that day, there was a car and truck in front of my house that I didn't recognize. My heart stopped. Was she serious? Did she have her family take a hit out on me? Better yet, I noticed that the truck had a gun mounted to the back glass of the windows. I wasn't about to go home and risk my life, so I tried to stay out of sight. My friend Lauren lived around the corner, thank God. I asked him if I could jump his fence over to my house so I could get in the back way. He didn't mind, and he even decided to take him and his sister to the front yard and scope out the situation. While they made for a distraction, I jumped into my backyard and went inside. From the windows, I could see that my ex's posse was on the porch, and luckily I didn't see that anyone had a gun. I was home alone, and I'll admit I was nervous. If she was going to threaten me like that, and her family was going to back her up on it, I was honestly scared that they would break in at any second to take out their vengeance on me. But soon, maybe an hour later, they left, and everything was normal for the rest of the day, except for another message on Snapchat, along with another new, creepy picture. Again, it was from my ex. She said, "So my family doesn't have the guts to do it, but I will. You better hope I don't see you out in public." The picture showed some duct tape, some rope, and what looked like a box cutter. This assured me that this girl really did mean harm, and I was beginning to fear for my own safety out in public. A few weeks go by without any incidents, and I was beginning to calm down. I met a new girl at school, someone who helped me with my homework, someone who cared enough to help me get on track. One day we were at the park sitting on the bench. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my heart stop. And of course, it was my ex. She was just eyeballing me, wide-eyed, from across the way. Instantly, I looked at my girlfriend, and I told her we need to get up and go. So we got up and left in my car. But only seconds later, after we pulled out of the park, I got a message. Luckily, it wasn't from her. It was actually from Lauren, my neighbor and friend. But he was pretty angry, because apparently she got his Snapchat info. She was now harassing him with the same sort of threats and creepy pictures out of nowhere. Well, I drove my girlfriend home, then I went to my house. Later that night, I heard a doorbell, and to be honest, it made me jump. You better believe I checked the windows before I ever thought of answering the door. I was home alone, and I didn't expect anyone to be home just yet. I didn't see anyone outside, and I didn't open the door. But throughout the night, I swear I heard someone walking through the bushes around the house. I heard scratching at my doors, like it was some wild animal trying to get in. And in the morning, when I finally had the courage to step outside when my parents were home, someone had keyed a message into my brother's old Buick. In big sloppy letters was one word: die. My family notified the cops and sent them to my ex-girlfriend's house, and I let them know that while I was with her, she did show me some paraphernalia in her back room. She was into the harder things, if you catch my drift, the much more illegal stuff. And thank God, the cops found plenty of things in that back room. She got in a lot of trouble and was sent to a special school by herself a few towns over. I was so thankful that I didn't hear from her again. All the bad happening stopped. I started working hard. I began to make better grades, and I even started a lawnmower business with Lauren. And I'm finally happy and safe. And none of that is thanks to my crazy ex-girlfriend. Let's never run into each other again.
I just finished my freshman year of college. I'm a female, and Snapchat is my main way of communicating with my friends. One day, I got a Snapchat notification that a boy named Ryan had added me. I opened Snapchat and added him back. I checked his Snap score and saw that it was 52,000, so he seemed to be a real guy. His username was Ryan and then a bunch of numbers that I can't remember. I sent him a snap of the top of my head and asked, "Who is this?" About a minute later, he responded. I opened his snap, which was all black, and said, "I saw you on Quick Add and thought I should add you." I left him on red after that, but I didn't delete him. Within a couple hours, I had forgotten all about him. That night, I was laying in bed and watching some TV before I went to sleep. I started to hear a light tapping on my window. I shut off the TV so that I could hear it better. After a couple seconds, I heard it again. There was 2 large bushes in front of my window, and when I looked out, all I could see was leaves and darkness. Then, I saw it. A hand came up from below the window and tapped a few times. I ran out of my room and got my dad, who was in the living room watching TV. He went outside and returned several minutes later, saying he didn't see anyone. I went back into my bedroom and tried to sleep. It took me a long time, but there was no more tapping on my window, and eventually I got some sleep. The next morning, I woke up and checked my phone. There was a snap from Ryan. It was a picture of my house that said, "Why didn't you open your window for me last night?" I went to respond, but he had deleted me. I thought about going to the police, but all I had was his username, and I figured there was nothing that could be done. That night, I was once again laying in bed and relaxing before I got tired enough to sleep. Once again, I heard tapping. This time, instead of running to find my dad, I texted him on my phone and said that the tapping was going on again. It continued for about another minute before I heard commotion outside my window and the sound of my dad yelling. I then called the police, and within 5 minutes they arrived. My dad was holding down the man, who turned out to be in his 30s, and the man was arrested. Since this happened, I turned off my snap maps, and I don't add people back unless I know them. This happened a few weeks ago. At about 10 p.m. on a Sunday night, my best friend texted me and asked me to come over. He said that a girl he had been Snapchatting wanted to come over and hang out, and she was bringing a friend, so I should hang out with them. He said we were all probably just going to sit and chill in the car and chat. I didn't really want to go, but he's my best friend and he's like a brother to me, so I thought, why not be spontaneous? I drove to his house and parked on the side of the road in front. He came out and got into the car with me. He said he had been Snapchatting with this girl for about a month, and she seemed pretty cool. He showed his snap map to me, which showed the location of his friends if they had it on. The girl had hers on, and it showed her on a road, which was about 10 minutes away. My friend and I hung out for a while in my car, then checked on her snap map again. It showed her in a city that was past us. My friend was confused as to where she was going, and so he sent her a snap. We waited several minutes for her to reply, but she never did. We checked her map again and saw her in the parking lot of a park, which was about 20 minutes away. My friend tried calling her, but she didn't pick up. It was now almost midnight, and we decided to call it off and both go home and go to bed. Just then, she snapped my friend back and said she was on her way. My friend decided to let her come over after all and said okay. About 20 minutes later, we saw a car pull up into the street and park about 20 feet behind us. My friend told her we were in a car and in front of her. We watched her get out, and when she did, we could see there was at least 3 large men in the car with her. "Did you see that?" my friend asked. "The men?" I said. "Yes," he responded. She got out and started to walk to our car. After she got about 10 feet, my friend told me to drive. I put the car in drive and pulled out of there. As I did, the girl looked pretty surprised and just stood there before the car she was in drove up to her and she got back in. I pulled off my friend's street and could see the car was starting to follow us. I turned as soon as I could and tried to lose the car. I drove a couple of miles toward the middle school that was near us, and I could barely see the car behind us. When I started to drive past the school, I could see a police car sitting in the parking lot, so I drove in and entered the parking lot. The car started to follow us and then drove past. We parked next to the cop, and he questioned us what we were doing. We told him the story, and when my friend went to pull up the Snapchat, he had already been blocked. The cop told us to go home, and we did. I'm glad my friend told me to drive, because I don't know what would have happened to us. This story happened to me about 3 years ago. Back then, I was really into Snapchat, and I used it more than any other form of communication. I had a lot of friends on Snapchat, and a good number of them I didn't even know. They just had mutual friends, or maybe they went to the same school as me. I remember a girl named Nadia posted on her story that she was selling her MacBook Pro computer for $1,000. This was a pretty good deal, and I was in the market for a new laptop, so I responded to her story saying I was interested. I offered her $800, and we settled on 900. We agreed to meet the next day in the parking lot of a garden center just off a highway. It was about a 20-minute drive for me, and I arrived to see the place was pretty quiet, with about 5 to 10 cars in the parking lot. I snapped her and told her I was there. She responded by asking what kind of car I was in. I told her, and she said she would be right there. I looked around, but I didn't see anybody in the parking lot, just some empty cars. I was parked next to some trees and a dumpster on one end of the parking lot. I started to go on my phone when suddenly out of nowhere I heard something hit the back of my car. I turned around to see a man behind my car. Then I heard something come from the front end of my car, and when I looked I saw another man out of my windshield. They both started hitting my car from the front and back. I scrambled to start my engine. The men tried to block me in by grabbing onto the front and end of my car so that I couldn't get out without hitting them. I was able to turn and push one of the men back just enough so that I had some space to turn and then back out. They both came running to my car and hit it a couple times, but I floored it and was able to get out of there. I drove straight home. When I got home, my car sustained some damage, but nothing too serious. I never bothered to report the incident because when I got back, of course, I was blocked by Nadia. This story happened to me last summer. I'm a 20-year-old guy and in my junior year of college. I was just relaxing on my phone in bed one night, a little bit past 1 a.m. I was right about to go to sleep when I saw the Snapchat notification on the top of my screen that a girl named Caitlin Smith had added me. Her name sounded sort of familiar to me, but I couldn't say that I knew who she was, so I went to the app and added her back. Then I went to Instagram and looked up her name to see if I recognized her. Unfortunately, there was very many girls by the name of Caitlin Smith to come up, so I had no idea which one was her, if any. I went on Snapchat again and looked at her snap score. When I saw that it was only 5, I immediately realized that this was probably a fake account, and then I deleted her on Snapchat. After that, I went to bed. The next morning when I woke up, my phone had several Snapchats on it from Caitlin Smith. At that point, I realized that I had my Snapchat settings so that even people that weren't my friends could still send me snaps. The first 2 were text chats. The first one read, "You deleted me," and the second one said, "Ha ha 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 ha." The next 2 snaps were both pictures, and they were all black with text of her cursing at me in various ways. I was pretty alarmed to see this, and when I clicked on her account once again, I saw that I had been blocked by her. I really didn't know who this was or why they were messing with me. Then came the scariest part. When I opened up my blinds in my bedroom window that morning, it revealed a sticky note that was stuck to it from the outside. I had to go outside to retrieve it to see what was written on it, and when I read it, it said, "Watch yourself." I remembered after that my Snapchat location was always on, and even though I had deleted the Caitlin user, we had still been friends for a good 10 minutes, which was more than enough time for her to screenshot my place on the map. I ended up texting all of my friends asking them if this was a joke, but to this day they all seriously deny it, and I really don't think it was any of them. Nothing happened again, but I have since made sure that my location is always off. I am a 19-year-old female and just recently graduated high school last year. This was by far the scariest thing to ever happen to me in my life. It all started midway through my senior year. I was relatively popular in high school, and I would get added on Snapchat by new people almost every day. I had so many friends on Snapchat that I didn't even know a good number of them. I was home alone relaxing in bed and watching Netflix while my parents were out shopping. I casually went on Snapchat and saw that I had several new snaps. One of them was from some username that I didn't recognize. I didn't know who this was, but I occasionally got snaps from people that I didn't know, and if I didn't want to talk to them, I'd just delete them and it was no problem. After responding to a few of my friends, I opened up the snap from the user that I didn't know to see who this was. Their username was pretty strange. It was like a bunch of random letters and then numbers that didn't spell any words or anything. When I opened up the snap, it was a video of a house. The video started by showing the house from the street and then zooming in towards a window. When I looked at the video for the second time, I saw that the house was mine. It was nighttime in the snap, just as it was outside, so it seemed to have just been taken. This immediately creeped me out, and I went from being relaxed to outright scared. The snap had been sent from the user 22 minutes ago, so I was hoping they had left, but just to be safe, I slowly looked out my window towards the street. When I did, I couldn't see anyone or anything. It all seemed quiet like a normal night. That made me feel a little bit better, but then I got another Snapchat from the user. With my hands shaking, I went to Snapchat and opened it up to see. It was another video. This time, it showed the inside of a basement, which I immediately recognized to be mine. We had an unfinished basement that had dim lighting, and I recognized the light fixture to be ours. I quickly ran to my door and locked it. Then I quietly listened next to my door for any noises as I dialed 911 on my phone. I whispered into the phone as the operator answered, and I explained to them what was going on. I then went into my closet and hid. I was told the police would arrive in 10 to 15 minutes. That was not what I wanted to hear at all, because it seemed like such a long time. The first 5 minutes went by, and they felt like an hour, but I didn't hear any noises or anything. Then I got another Snapchat from the user. I didn't care, and I wasn't going to open it because I knew it would only make me scared. But then I started to get more and more snaps from the person, and they were blowing up my phone. After that, they tried calling me. I stuffed my phone into some of my clothes and just waited for the police to arrive. A couple of minutes went by until I heard the terrifying sound of my bedroom doorknob being turned. I was glad I had locked the door, but I didn't know if whoever this was would be able to break it down or not. Just as I was thinking this, I heard one extremely loud bang from the door, and at the same time I heard this, I heard the sound of sirens off in the distance. There was not another bang, and instead I heard the noise of someone running away. I stayed hiding in the closet until the police arrived, and when they did, the man had run away. I was just grateful to be alive and well. The police stayed with me until my parents arrived home, and the person who was in our house ended up being caught about an hour later. He turned out to be a guy who had gone to my high school 3 years before me and had stalked me from my Snapchat to see where I lived. I don't know why he broke into my house, but he got in through a basement window. I figured I didn't hear it because I had my headphones in when I was watching Netflix. I later got the courage to look at the final snaps he sent me, and they were chilling. The first one was a video of my bedroom door with him approaching. Then, there was a picture of my door with the words "Come out" in all caps. And finally, he sent a picture of his face with an extremely creepy smile.
This happened around 2006 when I was 11 years old. My cousin Aaron was spending the week with my sister and I over summer vacation. At some point during the week, my mom decided to take us all to McDonald's. We ordered and took our food to the back of the McDonald's to sit at a table connected to one of those super long booths along the wall nearest to the bathrooms. Sitting on the same booth, but a few tables down, was an older man sitting by himself. He was probably in his 60s, a bit overweight, balding, and had huge lens 80s style glasses on. He was wearing a dirty t-shirt with gray sweatpants. When we first walked in, I noticed him, but he kept his head down and didn't seem to pay any attention to us, so I kind of blew him off and almost forgot that he was there. My mom had my brother in his car seat by the table and was feeding him French fries. He must have either choked or got sick because he started throwing up all over the place. My mom grabbed him and rushed into the bathroom with him, followed by my sister to help. Aaron and I were left alone at the table. All of a sudden, the old dude looks over at us and starts trying to have a conversation with us. It started with the casual, "Hey, how are you guys doing?" And then he said something about hoping my brother was okay. So we politely responded, thinking that's all that he wanted to say. But then he immediately started getting weird. He asked our ages, which we told him. And then he started asking our names and where our moms worked. So, being kids, we told him that also. The man then looked down at his phone and said that our mom had just texted him saying they would be a while in the bathroom and that he was supposed to bring us home because it was getting late. Although I knew my mom had never even talked to this man once. So even as a kid, I knew something was off. The man then grabbed our hands and said we should hurry. At this point, we were practically being dragged outside. We got outside and this man started leading us into an old run-down white van. He opened the back door and said that we could stay in there for the ride. Luckily, just then, some younger guy had spotted us and instantly went over and told the manager what was going on. As this was happening, my mom and my sister also came out of the bathroom, saw what was going on, and screamed while running outside to us. At this point, we hadn't gotten in the van yet, but the man was trying to push us in. Now hearing my mom's screams, I instantly started pushing back, trying to keep myself from entering. The guy quickly gives up as the manager and my mother are fast approaching. The guy gets in the driver's seat and steps on it with his back door still open. My mom was still yelling at us, and we started crying. We didn't know what to think. To this day, this experience still horrifies me. I don't know why me and my cousin were stupid enough to go along with what this guy was saying, but I'm just glad my mom showed up when she did. My first job was at McDonald's. This building was attached to a gas station and located off of a busy highway. I was 16 and started a 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. shift. This early, the store was usually empty, so only 3 people, myself included, were in the restaurant. These people were my manager, who was in the back, the cook, who was also in the back, and myself, the cashier, who was up front. I was wiping down the counter when a man who looked to be in his mid-30s or early 40s came in. He didn't order anything, but went straight to the restrooms, which were in the restaurant area just around the corner from my cash register. Many truckers and travelers would come in simply to use the washrooms and leave, so this was not an uncommon occurrence. I didn't think much of it, but after the man finished, he came up to the counter and said, "Excuse me, I just used the washroom, and one of the toilets is overflowing." I immediately came around the counter and let him lead me towards the restrooms. Suddenly, I got a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach and stopped dead in my tracks. I became very aware that no one was in the restaurant area, and the only other 2 people in the store were in the back and wouldn't be able to hear me if I went into the restroom. I felt this overwhelming sense of being lured in. The man had the restroom door open and realized I had paused. He said, "Come on in, I'll show you," which came off innocently enough, but it didn't sit well with me. I smiled and said, "I'll get my manager," and I started making my way back to the counter. "It'll only take a minute," he called out. I met my manager in the back and explained to him that a man was complaining about an overflowing toilet. My manager went to check it out, and I followed closely behind him. When we turned the corner, the man was gone, and we entered the restroom. No toilet was overflowing. We exchanged a look and never brought it up again. As we were leaving the washroom, I glanced into the parking lot, and I saw a car driving away. It was the man. He gave me a terrifying death stare as I drove off. To this day, I don't know what gave me that feeling to not follow the man into the restroom, but I'm glad I stopped to think about what I was doing. The whole situation only lasted a few seconds, but it felt like forever. I was young and trusting, and this man could have done who knows what, and I wouldn't have been hurt. He could have left, got away with whatever it was he had planned, and hit the highway. I got out of work at 6:30 p.m. and went to McDonald's to get an iced coffee. I pulled up to the drive-thru and there was a red truck in front of me with no cap on the bed. It's super wide, so I can't see the mirrors and thus can't get a glimpse of who is inside. I'm minding my own business when I noticed that the red truck had pulled up to the second pickup window. I didn't think anything of it, and just assumed they had a big order, and the McDonald's employees asked them to pull up so I could get my iced coffee from the first window. That's when I look up, and I see the truck's reverse lights come on. Okay, they must have pulled a little too far, and are backing up a little. No big deal. They keep backing up, without signaling at all to me. I slowly back up too. Luckily, there was no one behind me. They keep going until they're finally at the first pickup window. The McDonald's employee looks out the window at me, shrugs, and gives me a look like they were just as confused as me. A few minutes goes by. At this point, I'm just thinking about how strange and not a part of common etiquette it was to back up without signaling to anyone that you needed to do so. They could have easily hit me had I not been looking straight ahead. Now, about another 5 minutes goes by. No one is being given any food. I just wanted my iced coffee, and I'm starting to get a little annoyed that they backed up, thinking maybe they were told to go to the second window since I only needed the coffee, but they suddenly felt like refusing to do so would get McDonald's to get them their food faster, and thus they backed up to the first window. I honestly don't know. Anyways, I continue to sit there and wait for my food when I see the driver's side door to the truck open. Out comes a man, like 30 or 40 years old. He was wearing light khaki-colored overalls and a dirty white shirt. He starts walking slowly over to my car. I'm thinking, okay, maybe he's just gonna apologize to me for not signaling when he needed to back up. He gets to my passenger door window, turns so he's facing the window head on, and just stares at me. I'm waiting for him to signal to put my window down, thinking he had something to say, but he doesn't do anything. He just stands there and stares. That's when he starts to lift his hand to the door handle. I quickly lock the door. He immediately starts screaming and continues to attempt to open my now locked door. Not like an angry scream, more like a mentally unstable scream. The guy then goes from trying to open my door to attempting to break my window with his elbow. At this point, I want to drive away, but there was now a car behind me waiting in the drive-thru. I'm too close to both the cars in front of me and the car behind me to be able to drive off. Thinking quickly, I turn off my car, take the keys, and run inside the McDonald's in hopes he doesn't follow me. All the McDonald's employees saw this going down, and when they saw me running inside, they let me hide in the back until the man just leaves. The guy then proceeds to check all the cars in the parking lot to see if they were locked. We instantly called the police, and they were able to detain the guy. It turns out, the guy recently escaped from a mental hospital nearby and stole the car he was driving. The guy was carrying 3 different knives with him when the police detained him. Overall, this experience still scares me to this day. I'm just glad I was able to react fast enough to lock my door before he could open it and do who knows what.
I witnessed someone end their life at McDonald's. It happened a couple of years ago, and I don't really like to think about it too much. I thought sharing my story with people online would make it a little easier, so here it is. This is kind of my attempt to make peace with the situation, and I hope that the soul of this poor man is resting in peace. I don't remember a lot of the details. It all seems really fuzzy, like it was all just a bad dream that never should have happened. I do remember some stuff, though. I remember it was raining. It was 2 weeks before Christmas. I remember that I had just finished working overtime, so it was pretty late. I wanted to grab a quick bite to eat, but didn't feel like eating in my car. I always hate doing that, especially because of the smell, so I went in. I got a Big Mac from McDonald's. I was sitting in the corner of the store when I noticed a really tall man walk inside. He was dressed in standard winter clothes and had a long blue hat on. There was a lot of empty space inside of the hat on top of his head, and I don't remember exactly why it caught my attention. I watched him for a few minutes. I wasn't particularly interested. I was just sitting there eating and didn't really have anything else to look at. My phone was dead, and he was the only other customer in the McDonald's at the time. His body language stood out to me, though. I could tell that he was not in a good frame of mind. I mean, looking at this guy for a minute told you everything you needed to know about him. He was suffering and in a lot of pain. I'm not sure exactly what kind of pain. I could only make guesses. Maybe his wife had left him. Maybe his kids died. I'll never know what happened to him. All I will ever know is that it was bad enough to push him to the very edge, and enough to make him jump off. He stood in front of the cashier for a few minutes while he appeared to be looking at the menu. To this day, I don't know if he was actually considering ordering anything or if he was just waiting for the right moment to. So this was the layout of the store. On one side of the McDonald's, there was the counter where people could order their food, but the counter area didn't take up the entire wall. There was a separation between that and a small hallway that brought you to the bathrooms. I was on the other side of the McDonald's looking on. He had been standing there for a few minutes when he randomly decided to start walking down the hallway. He moved really slowly, like he was really trying to take his time. Step by step, he came closer and closer to death. And the weirdest part about the whole situation was that he didn't seem sad. Didn't feel like he was depressed. It was more of an apathy, like he had suffered so much that he just didn't care anymore, couldn't bring himself to bother with being alive. I don't know, maybe I just feel that way after having thought about this experience so much over the last few years. As he continued down the hallway, he got slower with each step, finally coming to a halt in front of the men's bathroom. He stood there for about 45 seconds. I'm not sure what he was planning on doing. My first reaction was that there was some kind of sign in front of the men's bathroom that it was closed, but that wasn't the case. I saw him pull something out of his coat pocket. He very slowly pointed it at his head. It was a pistol. It wasn't until I heard the gunshot that it registered what was happening. I saw blood go all over the place. His body fell to the floor with a thud. I screamed. I didn't know what else to do. I remember vomiting everything I had just eaten on what was left of my meal. If I hadn't been so disturbed, I would probably have been extremely grossed out, but I was in an absolute state of shock. I started speaking with one of the employees after a few minutes had gone by. He screamed what had happened. I told him that he pulled a gun out of his pocket and shot himself with it. One of the employees there was convinced that he had been shot by someone else, strongly hinting that it was me. I didn't quite understand why they thought so. Some disgruntled old woman, she was old, and told the police that she didn't think that the guy ended his own life. Whatever her motivation was, it really didn't matter. The police didn't take her very seriously from the start, and this obviously was done by his own doing. The security tapes proved as much. I'm not going to lie. It really bothered me that she had to make an already bad situation worse. I already answered some of the questions from the police officers about the story. I remember driving home that night. I remember how alone I felt. This had really taken a toll on me. I pray for that guy's soul every day. I really hope he's in a better place. I can't imagine how horrible things must have been for him that he would have offed himself in a public place like that. I haven't eaten out since this whole experience. I have the strange fear that I'm going to witness another one in public like that. I know it's not rational, but I definitely feel that way. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why this happened, and I probably never will.
There are two types of people who work at McDonald's, or fast food places in general. There are ambitious, intelligent people who are trying to work hard to achieve a goal, in the hopes that one day they'll be able to quit for the sake of something better. And then there are the losers, those with no ambition who have given up and have no desire to achieve anything other than a weekly paycheck. I like to consider myself in the first category. As I was working hard to afford my apartment while taking classes at the local community college, I normally worked the later shifts at the drive-thru window, which is the one spot most employees hated working the most. You constantly have to deal with extremely impatient, oftentimes very rude people who are on their phones or have music blaring, and oftentimes don't realize that I wasn't the individual who took their order, so it's not my fault if it's wrong. In addition to that, you're pretty much constantly on your feet and exposed to the elements. No matter how cold, windy, or rainy it is, you have to keep leaning out into it, wishing that you were in a warm car about to drive away from this place. My point being is please try to be more kind and patient with the drive-thru people. Yeah, some are lazy, but most are trying their best, and even though you only see them for about half a minute, a kind remark or a warm smile might make their day. Anyways, now that I've gotten that off my chest, I work the late shift with two people who I believe qualify for the second category of employees. Connie was a high school dropout who was almost always late and was never invested in what she was doing, and Harold was a deadbeat who often smelled like weed and only kept the job because otherwise his parents would throw him out of the house. He was 32 years old. So one night I was there after 11 p.m. by the drive-thru window on an extremely cold January night, flipping through the pages of my class notes and trying to keep warm by the fry machine. Connie was mopping while looking at her phone, and Harold was in the back probably getting baked in the walk-in cooler. That late at night, we rarely got customers, and if we did, they were almost always zonked-out college kids who used the drive-thru but never physically walked into the restaurant. I stood up and stretched my legs and told Connie that I was heading to the bathroom. It was around 11:30 at this point. I came back less than 5 minutes later, with Connie more or less in the same spot that she was before. I walked past her and turned the corner to return to the window, and froze dead in my tracks. There was a bald man in white face makeup and a black hoodie standing directly outside the window staring in. His eyes were wide, with a blank expression that read, "What kind of trouble can I create?" The figure made direct eye contact with me and smirked, and slammed his palm against the window. I had no idea what to do, and inside my head, the words, clown, mime, psychopath, danger, and death all exploded like fireworks. The window was already shut and locked to protect myself from the cold, but the doors were all unlocked, and this person could easily walk right in and grab any one of us if he wanted to. In my head, I kept referring to it as he, but honestly, I had no idea what the gender was. The outfit and makeup made the stranger look androgynous. Maybe that was the point. The figure slapped on the glass window again with its hand.
Open.
Drawing out the word like a snake. Now, even if the figure wasn't dressed like that, I was under no obligation to open the window. It's unlawful to serve walk-ups at the drive-thru window, certainly for their safety, but also for ours. I shook my head and backed away. I called over my shoulder, "Lock the doors." The whole time, this figure didn't break eye contact with me, and to the best of my memory, I don't even remember it blinking. It drew back its lips in a sinister smile, and I shit you not, its gums were black. I don't mean I was too far away that I couldn't see clearly. I mean its gums were as black as licorice.
Open.
It hissed again, louder this time. Its other hand slammed against the window, and it licked its lips with its tongue.
Open.
That's when a third hand slammed itself into the window. A left hand, and it was just as pale and as skeletal as the other two. I lost my shit. "Holy shit! Call the cops!" I screamed, and ran back into the office, which was the only room with a locking door and no windows. I heard Connie scream, "What the fuck?" And she dropped her mop and flew across the room and made for the back with me. All the yelling attracted Harold, and I shoved past him into the office and told him to look at the security camera. Sure enough, the white-faced creeper looked to have 3 hands on the window and was tilting its head back and forth, perhaps trying to discover where I ran off to. We locked the office door and called the cops, explaining to the operator that there was at least 2 prowlers outside acting in a threatening manner towards us. I kind of expected it to be over after I called the cops. If it was a prank, they would run once they realized they scared me enough to call 911. But it didn't end there. We watched as the figure left the drive-thru window, circled the building, and made for the restaurant door. "Is there a second one? Look for a second one," I panicked while still on the phone with the operator. Connie was freaking out, and Harold was muttering something about not getting the police involved, likely because he was carrying weed. That's when the power went out. Everything. Cameras, lights, phone, the whole building went down. And barely 10 seconds after we all quieted down after shouting at each other in the dark, we heard footsteps in the dining room area. "Connie, did you lock the doors?" I whispered. She didn't reply. I think she had her hand pressed over her mouth.
Open.
We heard a voice call from outside the room in the dark.
Open!
The shout came at least 3 more times, circling from the kitchen to right off the hallway where we were hiding. I was convinced I was about to die, and every decision I had made in my life that brought me there was flashing before my eyes. We heard footsteps pass the office. After another few minutes, we heard the wail of police sirens outside, and at any moment, we expected to hear gunfire and the police shouting at someone to get on the ground, but we never did. We waited until the police identified themselves, and opened the door and ran out into the parking lot. Since the power was down, we couldn't show the cops the security footage, so we just told them what we saw. They swept the whole building and said it was clear. The owner of that particular franchise store showed up about an hour later, after Harold and Connie had left. I waited for the power to be restored, so an officer could escort me back inside to collect my belongings. The next day my manager called me and asked me to work the night shift. I asked him if the creep from last night had been caught. When he said, "There was no creep," I told him I quit and hung up the phone. This story is completely true. I have no idea what caused the power outage, which apparently erased all the security footage from the day. Without proof on video, my manager and the cops concluded that it was an elaborate prank, but that third hand still bothers me to this day, even more so than its hungry, inhuman eyes. Sure, it could have been a prank, but I wish someone would just confirm that for me, so I can sleep again. Keep your windows locked at night, and if you hear someone tapping from behind the curtains, don't open them. A couple of years ago, I worked at a McDonald's in Kansas. It was a location with a large outdoor play place for the kids. In all honesty, if it wasn't for that thing, I probably would have kept my job much longer. Part of my responsibilities included maintaining the cleanliness and safety of the big, colorful, large, intestine-looking pyramid of tubes and slides. It goes without saying that kids are messy, and whenever one had a bathroom-related accident or there was an injury, I had to go clean and sterilize the thing the best I could. I'm a relatively small person, so I was able to access most of the spots in the play place just fine, and because of that, I knew the maze-like structure very well. It's ironic that I went to school to design skyscrapers, and the closest I ever got to that was becoming an expert with the inner workings of a McDonald's child trap. One night after work, my friend Nate and I decided to hang out and have a smoke before we drove home. The play place was closed even though the restaurant was still open. But instead of sitting in our cars, we unlocked the gate and wandered into the enclosure where the mini playground was, locking the gate behind us. Technically, we probably shouldn't have been doing that, but I felt given how much time and sweat I sacrificed to this thing, I had earned the relative privacy it could provide me. I sat at the base of one of the large tube slides and lit my cigarette, while Nate sat on a bench directly across from me. We had been talking for about 10 minutes. I shifted my weight in preparation to stand up, when from within the slide, something grabbed me hard on the shoulder. What felt like a large hand grabbed my left shoulder, tight enough to make my joints pop, and I felt an index finger and thumb brush the skin of my neck. I screamed and launched myself up and sprinted to the exit, pulling at the door frantically before remembering that it was locked and I had the key. As Nate assaulted me with questions about what just happened, I tried to catch my breath and stared back at the slide, waiting for a fellow coworker to emerge and laugh, having played a great practical joke on me, but nothing happened. I didn't hear a thing from within the structure. I unlocked the gate, walked out, and slammed it shut and locked it again. I ran back into the restaurant and immediately went to the back office to check the security video. The entrance and the spot where I had been sitting was monitored, as were 2 other angles that showed the majority of the small gated area, but there was still about a third of the structure that we couldn't see. After about 5 minutes of watching the monitors closely, I called a friend of mine who was a cop. He drove in about 15 minutes later, and together we walked back into the play place area, armed with flashlights and mace. We examined the entire structure. Not only was there no one there, but there were no signs that anyone had been hiding inside or had broken in. I was at a complete loss for words and feeling very foolish, but I knew with certainty that I had been grabbed. I barely slept that night, and the following morning I came in early to review the entire tape from the previous night. Not once did anyone emerge from the slide or the gate. Before we opened the place to the kids again, myself and the biggest coworker I had went through the whole thing again, but again, there was nothing found. The play place is completely enclosed within a fenced-in area, with only one gate leading in or out. The fence is around 8 feet high, not impossible to climb, but it would be extremely difficult. To this day, I'm still at a loss to explain what happened. Some people I tell this to are convinced I experienced something paranormal and that the play place is haunted. Others think I'm the victim of an extremely well thought out practical joke. At this point, I wouldn't even be angry to discover that. I'm just desperate to learn how it was done. I quit the job about 4 or 5 months after the incident. What bothers me the most is that if there was a living, breathing person there, they would have had to silently prop themselves up in that slide, fighting gravity, barely making a sound or breathing for me to have missed them, and then after they grabbed me, climbed back up the tunnel without making a sound. I didn't hear a whisper of movement behind me, or even feel the faintest hint of breath on the back of my neck. I really hope one day to discover the truth behind what happened, and why.
I used to work at a Starbucks here in Cardiff, and I've got to be honest, it's one of the better jobs I've ever had. The manager was brilliant, the other staff were nice and looked out for each other, so for a minimum-ish wage job, it was about as good as it gets. The only bad shifts to work were the first halves of Monday and Tuesday mornings, as the pre-work rush meant people were often at their absolute worst. I mean, don't get me wrong, people could be complete jerks at other times of the day or week, but the highest concentration of them was Monday and Tuesday mornings, without a shadow of a doubt. But rude customers aren't scary. Annoying and frustrating, yes. Chillingly cruel and calculating, not as much. Which is why this particular incident has stayed with me for so long, and I always seem to use it as my personal point of reference for how terrible human beings can be to each other. So, it's a Monday morning, and we're just coming to the end of the rush at around 9 a.m. 30 minutes more and the caffeine fiends will start to thin out, and we can get some coffee and make a smoke break of our own. I heard her before I saw her. Like, she was only just trying to get a handle on what had been pure harpy screeches just moments before. Some woman was on her phone, ranting away and not looking where she was going as she tries to find the back of the queue. In doing so, she cuts off this other bloke who politely informs her that she's queue jumping. I don't know if she actually didn't hear him or was just tactically ignoring him, but either way, this bloke has to tap her on the shoulder before saying, "Excuse me, believe I was ahead of you." The woman just shrugs this off at first, giving the guy a gesture like, "I'm too busy to listen to you." I remember the look of anger on the guy's face as she gently but firmly grabs the strap of her handbag and tugs her out of the queue before taking her place. I'm a bit torn about the whole thing. Like, yeah, it was righteous, but laying hands on someone, I feel like there could have been a better way to resolve the issue. But it wasn't like the guy had picked her up and thrown her, and due to the size difference, that was definitely a possibility. Anyway, she reacts like this had been the case, like him actually standing up to her was some horrific incident of assault, and starts demanding someone call the police, even though she herself was on the phone and simply refused to hang up. A couple of staff members and customers manage to calm the situation down, and we get the guy his coffee before one of my colleagues serves the angry woman. I didn't serve her, but when she got her order, she turns to be like, excuse me, this coffee isn't as hot as I asked for." No, I know better than to just argue with customers, and especially absolute whoppers like her. So I do as I'm asked and heat the coffee up a little bit more for her. I hand it back. She dips a finger in it and once again tells me, "This coffee isn't hot enough." Now, bearing in mind, she just watched me run some steam through it, but again, I do as I'm asked and give her back some literally steaming hot coffee that she proceeds to absolutely overload with sugar. No wonder she was in such a stinking mood. Her entire life was probably one big sugar crash, hence why she was such an unbearable person to be around. But little did I realize, that coffee wasn't for her. And on her way out of the store, she took the lid off of her scalding hot syrupy coffee and threw it in the guy's face as he sat reading his newspaper. God, the sound of that guy screaming was absolutely horrific. Like I didn't actually see the woman throw her coffee in the guy's face, so I thought someone had broken a leg or something. That's the only time I've heard someone scream in pain like that. When my old skating buddy absolutely shattered his leg on this visit to a Bristol skate park one year. But what followed in the coffee shop was pure chaos. People were pouring bottles of water onto this guy's face, ambulance staff and police turning up. I think the woman legged it as soon as she threw the coffee because, to my knowledge, no one was arrested. But the guy who had the coffee thrown on him suffered life-changing injuries. From what another colleague told me, the gross amount of sugar in the coffee meant that some of it actually stuck to his face like a kind of molten hot glue. He'd been left with terrible scarring for the rest of his life, and all because he stood up to some absolute monster in the queue that morning. That's what I find really scary, that some people out there are so unhinged that a seemingly normal interaction with them could end up with you suffering injuries you'll carry with you for the rest of your life. Just one moment of misjudgment, one little enough is enough moment, and boom, you're going to look at a very different version of yourself in the mirror for the rest of your natural life. For the past few years or so, I've lived here in Redwood City, California. Back in 2008, some of you might remember that a Philadelphia branch of Starbucks asked two African Americans to leave because they hadn't bought anything. They were accused of racism, there was a whole bunch of fallout from it, and in the end, Starbucks announced that it would no longer ask anyone to leave their stores as long as they weren't causing a disturbance. From what I heard, this prompted a bunch of trouble with homeless people hanging around Starbucks outlets and generally making a nuisance of themselves, but I can't really speak to that because the only homeless guy that ever showed up in my local Starbucks was Steve. Steve was about as far from the stereotypical idea of a homeless person as you can imagine. I remember seeing him in relatively clean clothes, tapping away on a smartphone that was charging from a nearby power outlet and not giving him a second glance. I walked in, got my coffee, and carried on my way to work. The next morning, Steve is there again, paper in front of him, tapping away on his smartphone. Only this time, as I'm in line waiting to give my order, I see him reaching for a grubby-looking backpack that seemed to contain all of his worldly possessions. It dawned on me that he didn't have a coffee in front of him, and when I thought about it, he didn't have one that day before either. And that's when I realized that Steve was in fact homeless. And it was then that I actually noticed how tired he looked, how the skin of his face was stretched around his eye sockets like he'd skipped one too many meals in his time. Steve was obviously taking advantage of Starbucks' new policy in order to get indoors and charge his phone, and although he was technically taking up the space of a paying customer, none who got an inkling of his living situation ever seemed to complain. This was until one day when Steve got himself into some kind of confrontation with a customer. I think maybe one of his bag straps was lying in the way of someone because I only looked up in time after hearing someone apologize. This big guy in a bad suit scoffed as he sat down close by, shaking his head. "Shouldn't even be here," the big guy said. I thought it was quite an obnoxious comment, but I'm far too much of an introvert to say anything about it. Steve tried to apologize again, but the guy started going off on him, telling him he shouldn't be there if he wasn't a paying customer. And in a display of kindness that'll stay with me for the rest of my life, the guy at the head of the line bought Steve a coffee and a red berry cheese Danish. There, now he has something, so mind your business. It wasn't one of those, and then everyone clapped, moments. It was still incredibly awkward since no one wanted to get into a shouting match at that time in the morning, especially not me. So after the fat guy was shamed into silence, he just sort of wrapped his double-smoked bacon and walked out, avoiding eye contact as he went. That's when I found out his name was Steve, and every morning after, if Steve was in the Starbucks, I'd always say hi and asked if he wanted a coffee or a red berry cheese. Some mornings he'd accept, Some he declined, and I came to learn that he used the charger and the free Wi-Fi to look for a job. He wasn't a drug addict, he wasn't an alcoholic, he'd just fallen on hard times after a nervous breakdown and was slowly building himself back up and putting his life back together. Learning that is how me and a handful of other Starbucks regulars developed a great deal of affection for Steve after a while, but our regular cheery encounters with him somehow made it easier to forget that he slept under Redwood Junction every night, and I guess assuring ourselves that Steve would be okay meant we could just walk away and not worry about it. Because one Monday morning when I walked into the Starbucks and saw Steve's seat empty, I automatically assumed it was good news. Maybe he'd found a place to stay, or maybe he'd struck gold in his job search, and I found myself asking the barista if they'd heard anything from Steve over the weekend. To my absolute delight, he told me Steve had an interview at a local car wash. He wasn't sure exactly what day, he just knew that Steve had made the announcement the previous afternoon before departing the store. So, that was the end of seeing Steve on my morning Starbucks runs. I hoped that he might show up again, buying his own coffee, looking healthier and happier, but he didn't, and I guess that was just fine. But at the same time, I'd have been lying if I said I didn't kind of miss him. Like I might have mentioned, I'm a card-carrying introvert, but I do enjoy a sense of community. I still enjoy the comfort of familiar faces, so anyone who makes me comfortable enough to come out of my shell, I appreciate that more than I think I can even describe. So after a few weeks of not seeing Steve at all, I decided to take a walk down to some of the local car washes to see if I could spot Steve. First place I asked hadn't heard of him, neither had the second place. But the third car wash I tried said that they were hoping I was the one who could give them answers. You see, the third place I tried was indeed the same place Steve had an interview scheduled, but it was an interview he hadn't shown up for. I asked if he'd called ahead to cancel or anything, and the car wash boss said no, and that he just ghosted. And that's when I really started to worry. My concern for Steve's well-being grew to the point where I began to entertain the idea of going down to the Redwood Junction to look for him. I hope I don't sound too prejudiced when I say I found it an intimidating prospect. Like, as much as I appreciate that a lot of homeless people are just like Steve, good people who've fallen on hard times, I know that there are some people in the streets who are so broken that they do actually pose a danger to the general public. But as I said, my concern grew and grew until I didn't give good care if the sight of homeless people camp would upset my delicate sensibilities. A man's life was at stake. I needed to act. I wasn't sure I'd be able to live with myself otherwise. That was how I ended up cycling down to the junction one Saturday afternoon, where I began nervously giving descriptions of Steve and asking if people had seen him. People mostly shook their heads at me, looking at me like I'd grown an extra nose or something. I guess having visitors to the camp wasn't exactly a common occurrence. Time and time again, I was met with the same response. A shrug, a shake of the head, complete indifference. At least until I spoke to one much older guy who wore a Vietnam veteran baseball cap and a grimy old fatigue jacket. This guy seemed a little bit more with it than some of the other homeless folks, and although he had a distinct smell of marijuana about him, he was lucid enough to get a straight answer from. After confirming we were talking about the same Steve, this vet told me that he knew him well, but that he hadn't been around the junction in a few days. When I pressed him for where Steve might have gone, the vet shrugged, but told me Steve had left behind a bunch of his belongings. According to him, this could be a good thing just as much as a bad thing. When some homeless folks find a way off the street, either moving back in with family or getting a place in a program somewhere, they leave behind all their stuff. Some just don't need it anymore. A tent and a sleeping bag are useless when you have a room and a bed. But others find that the stuff they had on the street just reminds them of a time they'd rather just forget about. But sometimes, leaving all their stuff behind meant something bad had happened. I could see the worry just etched into the vet's face, and he seemed to be racking his brain for a moment before an idea struck him. He mentioned that Steve used to bring food to a girl who stayed on the other side of the camp, and that maybe she'd know where he was. Up until talking to that girl, my time at the camp had been unexpectedly uplifting. Sure, seeing people living like that was upsetting, but seeing how nice some of them were, how they hadn't let their hardships break them down, seeing them purely as the human beings they are, I have to say, it was quite cathartic. Yet the visit to the girl's tent was the point at which the trip became more terrifying than I ever imagined it could be. As we approached the girl's tent, the vet greeted someone nearby and asked if a person called Mouse was home. They nodded, but added that she wasn't doing too good. I wasn't sure what they meant by that, but on seeing this Mouse girl curled up in a fetal position in her tent, I was almost certain it was drug-related. The vet gently shook the girl awake, and I'm pretty sure she was high from the way she lazily opened her eyes and how out of it she seemed. But then as soon as the guy mentioned Steve's name, the girl shoots wide open, and she gives him this terrified look before saying, I told him not to go. I told him not to, but he didn't listen. Now he's gone. The vet asks her where did she tell Steve not to go? She replies with, the cemetery, before bursting into tears. The last question we could get her to answer was what happened at the cemetery for Steve to be gone. She replied with, it took him. It. Not he or they. It. Hearing that word used like that caused this sinking feeling in my stomach. Not so much because of what it entailed, but because this girl was so messed up over what happened, and that obviously meant bad news for Steve. Before leaving the camp, I asked the vet what cemetery Mouse could have been talking about. I had my own idea of which one she was referring to. I just wanted to see if he had the same answer, and he did. He'd said he'd bet his last dime that she was talking about the historic Union Cemetery on Woodside Road. And I agreed because the historic Union Cemetery is right across the street from the hand car wash where Steve was scheduled to have his interview. I took all this information to the police, telling them I was a friend of Steve's before I had them file a missing persons report. I made sure to record the reference number I was giving, as I'd be able to use it to get in touch with whatever detectives would eventually be assigned to the case, I assumed. I tried all throughout that next week to get the relevant cops on the phone, but it seemed to take forever before the case was properly assigned. In the meantime, I thought I'd take a ride down to the cemetery to see if anything caught my eye. I don't really know what I was planning on doing. It's not like I knew anything about being a detective, but at the same time, I couldn't just sit on my butt and do nothing. So, for those of you that don't know, Redwood City's historic Union Cemetery isn't really a cemetery. It did actually function as one until about 1919 or so, but after that it basically became a kind of memorial. From what I can remember, some Civil War soldiers are buried there along with a few famous pioneers, so it's more for tourists and sightseers than grieving families or funeral processions. While walking up and down the gravel paths and checking out the old graves, it occurred to me that when the girl said, Steve is in the cemetery, it might have been her way of telling us that he was dead. There was every chance we just totally misinterpreted that, and I was in that cemetery on a complete fool's errand, wasting my time looking for something I wouldn't find. And if that's the case, what I found and saw next is completely irrelevant, and is naturally to be disregarded. But, and a big but here, if it is connected to the Steve disappearance, it raises questions that honestly don't bear thinking about. So, as I said, I'm walking down this gravel path, and a handful of people I see are just all checking out the statues, taking pictures, and all that other stuff. Only, I see this one guy, all by his lonesome, and he's walking with purpose, with a plastic bag in his hand. When I say walking with purpose, I mean he wasn't there just to hang around and check out the memorials. He was walking fast, like he wanted in and out in as short a time as possible. Just the sight of him filled me with curiosity, but it's not like if I rushed after him, he wouldn't freak out. So as much as I tried my best to follow him, he slipped away from my view almost as quickly as he had appeared. Only he'd left something behind, the white plastic bag having just dumped it behind one of the bleach-white tombstones, apparently in the hopes that it would remain hidden from public view. At first, I was just mad. Who leaves their trash in a graveyard or whatever? but I went to check out what the bag contained. It just looked like a bunch of organ meat. Like I 100% saw something dark enough to be liver in there, and some of the other pieces looked like chunks of white fat. It smelled real bad too, like he might have been hanging on to it for a couple of days before he'd left it there. To this day, it's probably one of the weirdest things to ever happen to me. Finding a bag of meat like that, just abandoned in the middle of a ceremonial cemetery. And like I said, whether or not it's even remotely connected to Steve's disappearance is anyone's guess. I mean, the detectives treated me like I was crazy when I brought it up with them in the weeks that followed. They'd sent some beat cops out to the cemetery and they hadn't found a thing. But I also know they seemed totally clueless in their investigation, like they either didn't care about it or just couldn't get a lead anywhere. And that's just how things went. I get in touch every so often, only to be told the investigator hadn't progressed anywhere. It didn't help that it had taken weeks for anyone to report him missing, and the fact that it was me that should have acted earlier gave me this horrendous sense of guilt for the longest time. Steve had no family out here, and I barely knew anything about him. The best I could do was share the few slivers of info I had with the cops, then just hope it came to something. But it came to nothing. And now Steve is just one more name on the missing persons register, a missing persons register that stretches a mile long. The rate at which homeless people go missing around Redwood City is considerably higher than the surrounding areas, and given how difficult it is to conduct any kind of census or research among the homeless, that figure could be even higher than the numbers suggest. The trouble is, people just don't care. Even people who purport to care about social justice are content to focus their attentions on ridiculous niche topics when homeless people are dying and disappearing on the streets of California every single day. I don't know what's going on out here. Whether or not it's just fentanyl killing people off, some kind of serial killer, or something less explainable. But something is killing homeless people at a totally disproportionate rate, and all kinds of other weird stuff is going on to boot. I just pray that whatever it is can be identified and stopped before more people like Steve are lost. People who try so hard to tread water, only to end up slipping beneath the waves. At around 5:15 a.m. on the morning of July 6, 1997, a Starbucks employee arrived at work to open up the Wisconsin Avenue Northwest branch of the world-famous coffee company, situated just north of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. There was a lot of work to be done before the morning rush, and the employee in question had yet to imbibe their morning espresso to really kick them into gear. So, by their own admission, they were pretty groggy by the time they headed out back to one of the freezer units, intending to fetch some of the breakfast pastries that would go on sale that morning. But when the overtired staff member cracked open the freezer unit, they saw something that made their heart race. Inside was the frozen, lifeless corpse of 25-year-old night manager Mary Catherine Mahoney, along with the bodies of 18-year-olds Emery Allen Evans and Aaron David Goodrich. Although they weren't always on the same shift pattern, the employees knew his slain coworkers well, and the horror of witnessing their frozen, discolored cadavers was almost too much to bear. They raced out of the Starbucks and flagged down a bus driver who was only just beginning his morning route, and given how they could have just called 911 from the on-site telephone, running to find the comfort of another living person is very telling of this person's distraught state of mind. Within 5 minutes of the initial 911 call, police were on scene and taking stock of the situation. All three employees had obviously been herded into the rear freezer units before being shot, execution style. But what initially confused the investigation was that not a single cent was missing from the Starbucks. If the motivation wasn't robbery, then it looked a lot like a brutally well-executed targeted killing. But why on earth would someone ambush and murder 3 coffee shop employees during their routine night shift? What made the murders all the more shocking was that Georgetown has been traditionally a low-crime area of Washington, D.C., with local district council member Jack Evans saying to have a triple homicide anywhere in the District of Columbia is an unusual event, but to have a triple homicide in Georgetown is extraordinary, and this has never been a place where crime has been a problem. Over the course of that balmy July morning, scores of blue-uniformed officials made their way to the scene to look for evidence outside the split-level brown brick store. Homicide detectives and forensic technicians alike pored over the scene for hours on end after the bodies were found, working inside and outside the building adorned with the familiar green and black logo. They dusted doors for fingerprints, searched the store, and took statements from local residents in the hopes of piecing together what had happened. But it was only when Mary Mahoney's car was examined that further evidence was found, evidence which indicated that the murders were no random attack. Inside, the car was spotless, save for what looked like signs that Mahoney had recently spent time playing with a pet: a dirty tennis ball, a plastic chew toy, a dog's brush, and a red towel. The only possible indication that something had gone awry was a flat tire on the front passenger's side of the car, evidence that her attacker had made provisions to prevent her from fleeing. Mary was special, her mother later said. She had an enormous heart. She probably would have compassion for the person who killed her. When she moved to Washington several years prior, Mary would jog alone an hour before daybreak, never worrying about being attacked or assaulted. She adored animals, particularly horses, and even took in Marlou, her sister Molly's toothless black and white alley cat. She attended various New York colleges before graduating with honors from Towson State University near Baltimore, and was a loyal and active Democrat, interning for Bill Clinton when he was first elected. Yet, according to her mother, it was her managerial job at Starbucks that really excited Mary. She had been employed by the company for 2 years and enjoyed being the manager. She was often seen sweeping the sidewalk in front of the store and obviously took pride in her store. What she didn't enjoy, though, was disciplining employees, particularly one that Mary had recently dismissed for allegedly stealing several $100s. She struggled with the issue before having to fire him, her mother said, and for a long time, this became homicide detectives' main theory regarding the Starbucks shootings. Yet despite their hard work and determination, they came up short at every turn, eventually turning to the televisual law enforcement institution that is America's Most Wanted. After picking the case up, America's Most Wanted staged a thorough recreation of the murders and detailed many of the theories that police were toying with. They also advertised the number of an anonymous hotline, pleading with those with any information to come forward. And it seems this appeal struck a nerve with one member of the public, who called in with not only a frightening piece of information, but also a rather courageous proposal. In the hours following the broadcast of the Starbucks shootings, a woman called into America's Most Wanted hotline to inform them that she was dating a man who actually knew the shooter firsthand. This mystery person had confessed, even boasted, of committing the murders, and on more than one occasion. The couple had initially taken the man's word as pure bluster, but after seeing the Starbucks shooting edition of America's Most Wanted, it became apparent that he might just be telling the truth. The woman then left her name and numbers so she could be contacted by DC police, and when they did so, she actually agreed to wear a wire for them, in the hopes that she could catch a confession on tape. It was then that they learned their suspect's name: Carl D. Cooper. Cooper lived in Prince George's County near Baltimore City and just on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. itself. He was the son of a church deacon who lived with his wife and son, but at the time, he lived anything but the wholesome life of a family guy. At the time of the Starbucks shooting, Cooper was being charged with attempted murder in a 1996 shooting of an off-duty police officer in Prince George County. As for his family's complicity in his crimes, it turned out that it was Cooper's wife that purchased the 9mm handgun that her husband used to shoot the officer. It was the combination of this and his alleged involvement in the Starbucks shooting that led DC police to wiretap Cooper's home phone. He was arrested after making reference to several local shootings, but insisted that a friend of his named Keith Covington had joined him in the Starbucks robbery, and it was him that executed the 3 victims. However, when they caught up with Covington, they discovered he had been recovering from a gunshot wound at the time of the murder, meaning it was highly unlikely that he was even present on the scene, let alone the one to have done the shooting. "If I killed them, I'd say I killed them," he reportedly said. But that's not me. I'm not saying I'm a saint, but I'm not going to go out and just kill people. You gotta be a dummy or a psycho to do something like that. It's pure evil. When confronted with the evidence of his lies, Cooper admitted to lying about his so-called friend's involvement because he killed 3 people and was afraid to go to jail. In the process of trying to avoid the death penalty, Cooper told the investigators he'd been staking out the Starbucks for about a month, confirming that he acted alone and fired 2 guns, a .38 caliber snub-nosed revolver and a .38 caliber pistol. Cooperating heavily due to the ever-looming threat of the death penalty, Cooper confessed to shooting the manager, Mary Mahoney, when she refused to give him keys to the safe, which held over $10,000 in cash. When she said no, Cooper shot a warning shot into the ceiling, which sent a terrified Mahoney running into the employee hall. Cooper pursued, caught her, and wrestled with Mahoney over her keys. But when her resistance looked like it would be too much to overcome, he shot her dead. He then shot the 2 other Starbucks workers at the store, executing one as they survived the attack and attempted to crawl to safety. Cooper later stated that he wanted to put him out of his pain and misery, but it's more than likely this thinly veiled attempt at showing he had a conscience was nothing but an attempt to dodge the first death penalty charge in over 30 years. During his trial, even when the relatives of the victims wept openly in court, Cooper remained chillingly composed. He also admitted to murdering a 39-year-old security guard named Sandy Griffin during a botched robbery. Cooper had helped Griffin at gunpoint before demanding that the security guard hand over their expensive .40 caliber handgun. But then, fearing Griffin would assault him in the process to defend herself, the serial murderer executed the security guard before quickly fleeing the scene. Cooper admitted to then selling the pistol on the street for $300. Once Cooper was convicted of the Starbucks murders and sentenced to life in prison, Griffin's relatives were no doubt pleased that their loved one's killer had been put away, but they expressed frustration that it had taken 3 more murders, maybe even more, before the killer had been caught. To them, a lack of urgency in the DC police force had cost 3 young people their lives and raised many questions regarding their competence and command. If the account of his defense attorney is to be believed, Cooper is nothing more than a career criminal whose shaky temperament and unbridled greed caused him to take the lives of the innocent. But time and time again, Cooper had the opportunity to simply take the money and walk away, yet he chose not to. He chose to kill people he just didn't need to kill, and he did this on more than one occasion. The first time might have been down to a simple rush of blood to the head, and it's a genuine possibility that killing the security guard was not part of Cooper's plans. But there's also a possibility that killing him proved to be something of a thrill that Cooper wanted to replicate in executing the 3 Starbucks workers.